In the mid-15th century, on the eastern edges of Europe, was a king whose name became one of the most fought over and abused in history. A man who is remembered for violence, political cunning, and merciless rule. His was the name of Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, also known as the Impaler, a nickname earned not through myth, but through deliberate and documented acts of punishment and spectacle. He did not drink blood, he was not a vampire. He was a human born into a shattered world of contending kingdoms and shifting frontiers. A man shaped by war, captivity, deceptiveness, and constant political peril. Vlad was a product and a master of dread, a leader who fashioned civic brutality, the instrument of political strategy, and who had foes not only beyond his frontiers, but in his own courts, villages, and even in his own household. This wasn't typical of the age, but Vlad's use of power was exceptionally crude. Removed threats not through long campaigns or complex diplomacy, but quite often with a single stake drawn openly for all to behold. Centuries later, his name served as the inspiration for fiction, but the actual story, the historical record buried under novels and myth, speaks something more chilling and more interesting. It is a story of regional survival, of European power struggles, of kings playing dangerous games with the Ottomans, with the Hungarians, with each other, and of how cruel reputations were made by both act and rumor. In the remainder of the next 2 hours you will be told the full story of Vlad the Impaler, not a monster, not a legend, but a ruler whose tactics earned both fear and reputation, whose reputation echoed on both battlefields of war and royal courtrooms, and whose legend was shaped so much by what he did, alarmed or shocked in his doing. You will hear of his early life as royal hostage to an alien empire, his bloody fights for the throne, his fight against domination from without, and the daily life of those who lived under his tenuous and often terrifying rule. Get settled in, let your mind drift into a colder, older world where power was bought at a cost, and tyrants like Vlad learned how to live by being more evil than their enemies. This is not a fantasy, but the true story of Vlad the Impaler and the world he contributed to in fear, mastery, and evil cruelty. The dark and haunting childhood of Vlad the Impaler. This chapter begins by exploring the early years of Vlad the Impaler, a time marked by intense political struggle, family danger, and a world shaped by ceaseless conflict. A childhood forged amid the harsh realities of 15th century Eastern Europe, where survival demanded constant vigilance, and the line between friend and foe was often blurred beyond recognition. Vlad was born into the noble family of Wallachia, a land nestled between the growing power of the Ottoman Empire and the competing kingdoms of Hungary and Poland, a place where loyalty shifted unpredictably like the wind across the mountains, and survival was a daily challenge demanding both strength and cunning from all who lived there. His father, Vlad II, known by many as Vlad Dracula, was a knight of the secretive Order of the Dragon, an elite chivalric group sworn to defend Christianity from the relentless advance of the Ottoman forces. The family name, Dracula, which means dragon or devil in the local language, reflected a mix of honor and fear that followed the family through the centuries. From his earliest days, Vlad lived in a world filled with danger and uncertainty, where rival noble families engaged in violent competition for power and influence, while foreign armies lurked just beyond the borders, waiting for any sign of weakness to strike and claim the land for themselves or their rulers. Vlad and his younger brother Radu spent significant parts of their childhood far from home, held as political hostages at the Ottoman court in Constantinople, a practice common in medieval politics meant to guarantee the loyalty of regional rulers, but one that shaped Vlad's early understanding of power, control, and the constant presence of betrayal. Life in the Ottoman palace was harsh and unyielding, surrounded by customs and traditions unfamiliar to a Wallachian prince. Vlad learned early the importance of caution, discipline, and strength to survive. The intrigues and dangers that surrounded him, he witnessed both kindness and cruelty, wielded as tools by those in power to maintain control and influence. Despite the hardships and alien environment, Vlad's connection to Wallachia remained strong through years of observation from afar. He absorbed the chaotic political landscape, the shifting alliances, the betrayals, and the violence, growing steadily more determined to reclaim his birthright and to assert control over his ancestral lands when the opportunity arose. The world around Vlad was deeply unstable and dangerous. His father's rule faced constant threats from enemies both inside the court and beyond the borders, an environment where trust was scarce, loyalty fragile, and betrayal frequent, requiring rulers to be ruthless and unyielding in their methods to maintain power and survive. Stories and records of Vlad's childhood often describe a young boy shaped by fear and the need for survival. His experiences during those early years planted the seeds for his later reputation as a ruthless leader, where terror was not only a consequence of his actions, but a deliberate method of maintaining order and authority in a fractured world. As Vlad grew older, the challenges he faced only intensified. The ever-present threat of war, rebellion, and assassination surrounded him at every turn, building the foundation for the man who would become known throughout history as the Impaler, a figure feared for his merciless justice and unrelenting defense of his domain. Understanding Vlad's early life reveals the origins of his harsh methods. A ruler molded by a world where mercy was rare and power meant everything. His childhood was a crucible that forged not only a legacy of brutality, but also a complex character shaped by loyalty, vengeance, and survival instincts, remembered and debated centuries later. In the villages and forests of Wallachia, the people lived in constant uncertainty. Every day brought news of battles lost or won, alliances broken or made, and the looming threat of invasion from the Ottoman Empire or rival Hungarian forces, underlining the fragile nature of peace in Vlad's youth and the precarious balance his family had to maintain to survive the turbulent times. Vlad's earliest memories were likely of whispered conversations behind closed doors, plotting and scheming by nobles, fearful of losing power and influence as much as by foreign powers seeking to expand their reach. His father's position was never secure, and the young prince would come to understand that the world of politics was a place where trust could mean death. The harsh lessons learned in his formative years were not only about politics, but about human nature. The cruelty of those in power, the ease with which alliances could shatter, and the necessity of instilling fear to command obedience and respect, a theme that would come to define Vlad's later reign as he sought to control a divided and dangerous land through terror and punishment. Even as a boy held captive in a foreign court, Vlad had to navigate a complex web of relationships. He was a pawn but also a student, learning the arts of diplomacy, intimidation, and survival in a world where weakness was fatal and strength was the only currency accepted by rulers and soldiers alike. His time in captivity exposed him to the grandeur and the ruthless politics of the Ottoman Empire, the sophistication of their military and administrative systems, and the brutality with which they enforced control over conquered territories, all elements that would influence Vlad's own strategies when he returned to Wallachia to reclaim his throne. Throughout this period, Vlad's personal character began to take shape, influenced by the fear he experienced and the desire for power and revenge that grew with each passing year. The political instability at home, coupled with his experiences as a hostage, instilled in him a determination to become a ruler, feared and respected without question. By the time Vlad was released or escaped from captivity, he was no longer the innocent boy but a young man, hardened by years of hardship, danger, and political education, ready to face the challenges awaiting him in his homeland, where his family, as enemies awaited, and where the throne would be a prize soaked in blood and betrayal. The story of Vlad the Impaler's childhood is not one of fairy tales or legends, but a brutal reality that shaped a man whose name would become synonymous with terror. The darkness of his early life provides important context to understand the harshness and the cruelty that marked his reign, and explains why he chose fear as his greatest weapon. Following the years spent as a political hostage, Vlad's early life was shaped by the harsh realities of medieval power struggles and family survival strategies. The environment in which he grew up was marked by constant tension, threats of violence, and the fragile loyalties that defined Wallachian politics in the 15th century. A time when borders were fluid and the ambitions of kings and warlords shaped the fate of entire peoples. The political landscape surrounding Vlad's family was intensely unstable. Rival factions competed ruthlessly for control of the Wallachian throne. Foreign powers like the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary constantly intervened to advance their own interests, creating an atmosphere thick with distrust and fear, where peace was fragile and often short-lived. Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula, faced repeated challenges to his authority from rebellious boyars and external enemies alike. forcing the family to navigate a maze of alliances, betrayals, and violence that would leave a lasting mark on young Vlad's view of power and survival. These constant dangers deeply influenced Vlad's education, shaping him far beyond the lessons expected of a noble boy. He was trained to understand the brutal realities of rule, the necessity of ruthless decisions, and the harsh consequences of weakness. His time as a hostage in the Ottoman court was a brutal school in patience, careful calculation, and the necessity of decisive action, at times violent action, to protect oneself and one's family from destruction. Vlad's childhood was one without comfort, innocence, or reprieve. Instead, it was a time where fear and survival were relentless companions. His family's precarious position demanded that he grow up quickly, mastering political strategy and the ability to inspire obedience through a combination of strength, intimidation, and often terror. His early life was a crucible, where compassion was replaced by pragmatism, and where power was the only currency that mattered. The threat of assassination or betrayal was a constant shadow Vlad could never ignore. His father's rule was marked by harsh punishments meted out against perceived rivals within the nobility, often with a severity designed to send a message and secure power. These measures reinforced a culture of fear that surrounded Vlad from his earliest years, shaping his understanding of leadership as an act that must be ruthless and uncompromising. To succeed, Vlad's family relationships were complex and filled with layers of respect, obedience, and fear. His relationship with his father blended admiration and caution, while his bond with his younger brother Radu was marked by shared hardship. Yet contrasting temperaments, both brothers bore the burdens of their upbringing, but each would respond differently to the challenges of their time, creating a dynamic that influenced Vlad's power. The world Vlad inhabited was one where loyalty was conditional and alliances shifted as quickly as the winds over the Carpathian Mountains, forcing him to learn how to navigate a treacherous political landscape where trust was fragile and often betrayed. This upbringing deeply influenced his later approach to governance, where he balanced the building of alliances with strategic displays of power designed to deter opposition and enforce obedience. Education for Vlad was comprehensive and harsh. He learned not only the arts of war, including arms handling and military tactics, but also the customs and governance methods of neighboring powers. His years in Ottoman captivity exposed him to the empire's sophisticated military techniques and administrative practices, knowledge that he would later adapt to the turbulent and divided landscape of Wallachia upon his return. The cultural and religious environment of Vlad's youth was complex. Wallachia was a predominantly Orthodox Christian region, surrounded by Catholic kingdoms to the west and the Islamic Ottoman Empire to the south and east. This religious diversity added another layer of tension to the political struggles Vlad would face and shaped the conflicts and alliances that defined his reign throughout his life. Throughout his childhood, Vlad observed firsthand the consequences of weak leadership and the chaos that often followed contested power. His experiences convinced him that a strong, often harsh hand was necessary to maintain order, to protect his people from external invasions and internal rebellions, and to secure his family's claim against persistent threats. The seeds of Vlad's later reputation for cruelty and his notorious use of impalement were planted during these formative years as he internalized the brutal lessons of medieval politics. His understanding of justice became intertwined with the use of fear and terror as essential tools to control and unify a fractured society, struggling for survival amid relentless threats and unrest. By the end of his childhood, Vlad was transformed from a captive prince into a young man ready to reclaim his family's place in the history of Wallachia. His early years had been dark, difficult, and full of danger, but they had provided him with the experience, resolve, and willingness to face the turbulent times ahead, with determination to do whatever was necessary to survive and rule. The villages and forests of Wallachia during Vlad's youth were places of constant uncertainty. The everyday lives of the people were overshadowed by the threat of war raids and shifting allegiances. The fragile nature of peace required constant vigilance and the readiness to defend against invasions from the Ottoman Empire or Hungarian forces. Vlad's earliest memories were shaped by whispered conversations in shadowed chambers, the plotting and scheming of nobles fearful for their lives and fortunes, the precariousness of his father's rule, and the frequent threats from enemies both inside and outside the court left little room for safety or trust for the young prince. The harsh lessons Vlad learned in his youth extended beyond politics. They included an understanding of human nature, the cruelty of those who wielded power, the speed with which alliances could collapse, and the necessity of instilling fear to command respect and obedience. Lessons that would come to define his later reign as he sought to unify a divided and dangerous land through terror and discipline. Even as a boy held captive in a foreign court, Vlad was forced to navigate a complex web of relationships. He was both a pawn and a student, learning the arts of diplomacy, intimidation, and survival in a world where weakness could mean death and strength was the only currency accepted by rulers and soldiers alike. His time in captivity gave him a unique perspective on the Ottoman Empire. The grandeur of their courts, their military discipline, and the brutality with which they maintained control over vast territories all left a lasting impression on the young prince. These influences would shape his own methods. When he returned to Wallachia to rule, Vlad's personal character was forged in this crucible of fear and ambition. The experiences of his youth instilled in him a desire for power and revenge that would drive much of his later actions. The unstable political environment at home, combined with the lessons of captivity, convinced him that only through fear and unyielding strength could he secure his position. By the time Vlad left captivity, he was no longer a boy but a hardened young man ready to face the challenges awaiting him at home. His family's enemies awaited his return, and the throne was a prize soaked in blood and betrayal. The story of Vlad the Impaler's childhood is not one of legend or fantasy, but of brutal historical realities that shaped one of history's most feared rulers. As Vlad transitioned from the uncertainties of youth to the early edge of manhood, his experiences both inside and beyond Wallachia, as volatile borders began to merge into a single hardened vision of leadership, forged not in peace or comfort, but in betrayal, loss, and a relentless exposure to human cruelty and shifting power. The world that raised Vlad was not one that allowed hesitation or gentle reflection. It demanded conviction, the kind of resolve that could either unify or destroy. By the time Vlad returned to Wallachia in the early 1440s, he was no longer a passive observer to the ambitions of others. He had become a vessel filled with knowledge of politics, warfare, and fear. Tactics not as theory, but as lived experience. His time as a political hostage in the Ottoman court had granted him a rare window into the internal workings of one of the most formidable empires of the age, a court rich in ceremony and merciless in consequence, where kindness might be offered in one breath and execution ordered in the next. These years in exile were not spent idly, though they were filled with tension, uncertainty, and cultural alienation. Vlad had watched and remembered every slight, every betrayal, every expression of raw power and fragile diplomacy. The long shadow of the Ottoman Empire loomed across all his decisions, and the lessons drawn from that shadow would guide many of his most brutal policies in the years to come. But the return to his homeland was not a triumphant homecoming. Rather, it was a plunge into yet another pit of political intrigue. Wallachia's throne had become a revolving door, claimed by one ruler, only to be seized by another in short time. The boyard nobles who held significant regional power had no loyalty to one prince or another. They pledged support to whomever could secure the throne and keep it by force or manipulation. Vlad's father, Vlad, Dracula, who had once walked the line between allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan and cooperation with Hungarian forces, was ultimately betrayed by that balance. When it proved unsustainable, his enemies, including rival noble families and political opponents from both inside and outside, Wallachia eventually turned against him. Vlad, Dracula was ambushed and killed in 1447, an event that marked one of the most painful and transformative episodes in young Vlad's life. The death of his father was not only a personal tragedy, but a potent political lesson. Vlad learned that loyalty, even from one's closest allies, could vanish in an instant, replaced by ambition, or fear, or promises of favor from foreign lords. His older brother, Mircea, who had also posed a threat to rival claimants, was reportedly tortured and blinded before being buried alive or drowned. According to some accounts, a grim reminder of how dynastic power was often bought with blood. These events carved deeply into Vlad's mind, fueling the fire of vengeance and shaping his philosophy of rule. He came to see fear not just as a response, but as a tool, a necessity, one sharpened by the betrayal of friends, the loss of his family, and the fragile nature of alliances formed without absolute power. The years that followed were marked by exile, flight, and scheming. Vlad sought sanctuary in various courts, including that of the Hungarian king John Hunyadi. Though their relationship was fraught with suspicion and shifting interests, Vlad navigated these treacherous waters with the same cautious intensity he had learned in the Ottoman court, always weighing the risks of trust against the rewards of patience. In 1448, at barely 17 years old, Vlad made his first bid for the throne of Wallachia, capitalizing on the absence of Vladislav. To a rival supported by Hungarian forces, Vlad briefly held the throne for a matter of weeks, but was soon forced into retreat. This short and unstable reign did little to establish control, yet it marked the beginning of Vlad's lifelong obsession with reclaiming and securing his rule over Wallachia. The failure of this initial attempt only deepened his resolve. He had tasted the power he believed was rightfully his, and having once felt it slip through his fingers, he began to understand the steep price required to make it permanent: the betrayals of boyars, the vacillations of foreign monarchs, and the unreliability of kin. Vlad that only through absolute authority could Wallachia be brought to order, and only through terror could loyalty be assured. Vlad spent the next years maneuvering between factions, biding his time, and observing the fates of other pretenders to the throne. He watched as Wallachia fell deeper into instability, shifting between rulers and allegiances with alarming speed. The region was a chessboard in which every piece was capable of treachery, and every ally might become a rival before dusk. It was during these formative years that Vlad began building the network of supporters and informants who would later help him regain power. He learned to appeal not to love or shared values, but to fear and necessity, promising safety in exchange for obedience and death in exchange for defiance. The dual path of protector and punisher became central to his emerging leadership style. These years also solidified the ideological framework through which Vlad viewed both his enemies and his own people. To him, Wallachia was a fractured and fragile state, vulnerable to external domination and internal corruption. Only a leader capable of extraordinary cruelty could bind it into something durable and free from foreign meddling or aristocratic treason. His legacy as the Impaler was not a spontaneous cruelty, but a slow-burning philosophy of order through dread. He also began to understand the symbolic power of violence, the way public executions and fearsome punishments could not only deter enemies, but instill psychological control over the population. In a land where whispers of insurrection traveled faster than soldiers could march, the image of an unyielding prince who punished disloyalty with legendary brutality served as both myth and message. As he matured into his 20s, Vlad had transformed from the child prince tossed between empires into a hardened political strategist, determined to restore his family's name by any means necessary. His experiences had taught him that compassion was rarely rewarded, and that, in a world as torn as Wallachia, only the most ruthless survived. With honor he kept alive the memory of his father's downfall and his brother's murder, not only as sources of grief, but as justification for the retribution he would one day unleash upon those responsible when he returned to power. It would not be as the cautious boy who once feared the Ottoman court or the uncertain pretender, backed by fragile alliances. It would be as a ruler who had studied pain, who had lived in the margins of betrayal, and had emerged convinced that only the sword and the stake could build a throne strong enough to endure. This understanding became the foundation of his later rule, when tales of impalement would travel beyond borders, when foreign merchants would speak his name in whispers, and when entire villages would submit without resistance at the sight of a single forest filled with corpses. It was not madness that drove Vlad, it was memory, strategy, and a belief that fear alone could create peace. By the time Vlad was ready to reclaim the Wallachian throne, once again he carried with him the scars of a youth spent between dungeon and court, battlefield and betrayal. His soul had been tempered like steel in fire, and his heart had grown cold, not for lack of feeling, but because warmth had never been allowed to take root in a world where only strength survived. His childhood had not only ended, it had been buried beneath layers of vengeance, history, cruelty, and purpose, and what rose in its place was a man who believed that he alone could cleanse the land and forge a kingdom through terror and discipline, through calculated horror and unbending will. A prince who would one day be feared across empires and remembered for centuries as the Impaler. The year was one that came with bitter frost and the memory of blood still fresh upon the ground of Wallachia, and when Vlad stepped once again onto the soil that birthed his name, It was not a return marked by celebration or joy, for the land was fractured, broken, by the same hands that once fed it promises of order and security, and now fed it only ash and the noise of steel. The year was one that came with bitter frost, and the memory of blood still fresh upon the ground of Wallachia, and when Vlad stepped once again onto the soil that birthed his name, it was not a return marked by celebration or joy, for the land was fractured, broken, by the same hands that once fed it promises of order and security, and now fed it only ash and the noise of steel in the dark. Wallachia had become a kingdom without a heart, ruled by whispers and knives, and the dying breath of men who dared to speak truth in the courts, where power shifted like the wind. And Vlad came into this place, not as a guest, not as a prince, not as a son, but as something altogether, changed by the agony of foreign chains and the silence of foreign halls, where he had been forgotten. His father, Vlad Dracula, once walked these valleys with a sense of iron purpose, and though his alliances were as slippery as the politics of the Danube, he had believed in survival above all else. He had given sons for diplomacy and bled for a throne that was never secure. And yet the soil rewarded him only with betrayal, and his end came, not with honor, but with ambush and blades buried deep by those he once fed. And Mercia, the elder brother, strong and loyal and true to the Wallachian cause, was not spared the cruelty of ambition, for they took his eyes first and threw him into a pit where light would never reach, and there buried him alive, while the boy Vlad remained in distant captivity, where even screams could not travel, and mercy was a story told in lies. So when Vlad stepped through the forests of his homeland again, he did so not with the naivete of youth, but with the quiet, measured breath of one who had watched empires from the edge and returned knowing that the only truth was survival, and the only God was power, and that every kindness left unpaid became a future betrayal waiting to bloom. The towns had not forgotten the name, but they had forgotten the face, and they saw in him the ghost of the past, and perhaps something darker, for he did not carry the weight of exile like a man defeated. He carried it like a blade, sharpened by absence, ready to cut into the legacy that had once cut him and make it bleed in return. Every hall he entered, every lord he greeted, every knight who looked upon his arrival with doubt fed something within him that had not been present before. And it was not vengeance or rage, but calculation, a cold understanding that this world would not bow to the old rules of honor or lineage. It would bow only to fear. So he learned to smile in the presence of traitors and speak gently to those who once raised swords against his blood. He bowed when needed and offered hands to men whose names were soaked in the very ruin of his house, and he kept record not on parchment, but behind his eyes where nothing could be burned. He walked among the dead in cities that lived, and every alley told a story, and every whisper was a thread, and he gathered them like a spider who had lived in another web for too long, and returned knowing where the strands would snap and which flies would dance into his grasp. If he simply waited long enough, there were alliances to forge, not with love or faith, but necessity, and he began to see in the broken order of the Wallachian court the outlines of something. He could use something, he could bend, and though he was still without crown or command, he understood the game. Now, not as a player, but as the board itself, his time in captivity had taught him that rulers are not born from blood, but from fire and pain and silence. And now, with those things etched into his spine, he became something neither the Ottomans nor the Hungarians could shape anymore. He had learned to carve himself from ruin. The cold mountains watched him, and the rivers carried the news of his return in soft voices, and the old peasants in their fields saw the boy and remembered the father and lowered their heads, not out of loyalty, but out of something more ancient fear of what silence breeds when left too long in shadow. He visited the place where his brother had died, though no marker stood, and there in the frost-covered earth he stood for a time unmoving. And though no prayer left his lips and no tears warmed his cheek, the silence was louder than any scream he could have given for it. It was here that the boy ended, and something else took hold. From that place he began to move, not with the recklessness of youth, but with the certainty of history, repeating itself, unless shattered, and remade, and so every step was one of judgment, every meeting a trial, and every word spoken a tool or a weapon, depending on who held it. He met with the boyars who thought him still the captive prince, whose chains had taught him humility, but he met their laughter with stillness, and their mockery with patience. And behind his eyes the memories of darker nights burned where no such men had dared to speak for fear of the stake. And though he had no army yet, and no seat of rule, he gathered strength not in soldiers but in knowledge, and in secrets, and in the hidden fractures of a court that was already crumbling under the weight of its own sins. And soon he knew who had killed his father, and who had betrayed his brother, and who would do it again given the chance. In this broken land, torn between empires and ambition, Vlad saw not despair, but opportunity for chaos. Is a language, and he had learned to speak it fluently and in silence. He prepared not for vengeance, but for transformation for the land. Did not need another prince, it needed something else, something terrible enough to be remembered. And so ended the first chapter of his return, not in the echo of war or the thunder of rebellion, but in the quiet rustle of papers sealed in wax, the whisper of knives traded in the dark, and the long cold nights where a man stood alone in thought, surrounded not by courtiers or friends but by shadows and plans and the memory of graves. Here in this place the boy who had once been taken from his home now stood not as victim but as witness and judge of a kingdom he would not inherit but claim by force and by fire. And though no trumpet sounded and no bell rang, this was the beginning of the reign that would make his name known to both legend and nightmare. This was not yet the Vlad who impaled. This was the Vlad who watched and waited and walked through the ashes of old rule, with eyes that saw what others feared to dream, and hands that would one day write history, not with ink, but with iron and smoke and silence. And thus did the first chapter close, not in peace, but in the slow gathering of storm, and in the breathless pause before the blade falls, for Wallachia had not yet seen its darkest days, and neither had Vlad, for the ghosts of his childhood had not left him. They had merely changed shape and followed him into the future he was about to create. The image of Vlad the Impaler did not grow from fantasy or myth, but from real policies and acts that were visible to those who lived under his rule and to those who passed through the lands. He governed with iron and pain the hills of Wallachia, bore silent witness to what his rule looked like, the roads lined with the staked bodies of those who defied him, the villages burned if suspected of sheltering enemies, and the townsfolk compelled to obedience, not by faith in his wisdom but by the knowledge that even a whisper of defiance might lead to death in the slowest, most terrifying way. His early reign was shaped not by desire for peace, but by a thirst to secure the throne through elimination of rivals. And this extended not only to political foes, but also to those whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. The people who had power in Wallachia before his rise, especially the boyar, were seen not as assets, but as potential traitors, and thus they were targeted systematically. Vlad understood that mercy often left seeds of rebellion, but fear planted no roots. Except silence and submission. It was in this way that he began to craft the mechanism of terror, not just by executing, but by performing these executions in ways meant to shock and to last. The method he favored most was impalement, which required a long, sharp wooden stake, often greased at the tip and inserted into the body, so that the victim remained alive for hours or even days, sometimes moaning in agony, while the people around were forced to watch, not just to witness death, but to learn the lesson that obedience was not optional. He built his power on this spectacle, creating an atmosphere where any offense, imagined or real, might result in public punishment, where stories of his cruelty traveled faster than his armies and subdued towns. Before his men ever reached them, he made his reputation a weapon, one that could strike fear across borders and into courts of kings who would rather keep their distance than confront a man who did not play by the same rules, who did not respect the unwritten limits of noble behavior. Vlad did not believe in compromise, he believed in outcomes, and he had learned from a young age that those who showed weakness were overtaken quickly. He had seen it in the Ottoman court as a hostage, he had seen it in the fall of his own father and brother, and he resolved never to repeat their mistakes. So when he reclaimed Wallachia, he did so with one goal: to keep it, and to keep it by removing any hand that might pull the crown from his head. This transformation from a rightful prince to a ruler feared across Europe did not happen by chance. It happened step by step, as he solidified his rule through a brutal cleansing of all those who might speak against him or hesitate to serve him without question. It was not about justice or even vengeance. It was about message. Every body left to rot on a stake told a story, and that story was simple. Disobedience will not be tolerated, mercy will not be given, and your life belongs to the will of the prince. The policies of Vlad the Impaler went beyond mere executions. They reached into the economic and social structures of Wallachia. He imposed strict laws that punished theft, dishonesty, and betrayal with extreme penalties, hoping not only to punish but to instill a fear so deep that even the thought of breaking his law would be terrifying peasants. Merchants, even foreign visitors, were aware that a single misstep might lead them to the same fate as those whose bodies stood nailed to wooden stakes. Along the roads, foreign envoys recorded these scenes in letters and reports that survive, to this day horrified at what they saw, but also acknowledging the strange order that seemed to follow in his wake. Crime dropped dramatically under his rule, not because the people loved him, but because they feared him more than they feared hunger, more than they feared invaders, more than they feared God himself. In the eyes of many, Vlad had made himself a living threat, more terrible than death. He also used his brutality to deliver political messages. When threatened by external forces, he responded with acts so shocking that they echoed through the courts of Europe. When the Ottomans sent envoys demanding tribute, he had them killed for failing to remove their turbans, claiming it was disrespectful to his court, and nailed their head coverings to their skulls as a message. When Turkish forces invaded, he responded not only with battle but with the mass impalement of captured soldiers, creating a forest of the dead so vast that enemy scouts turned back before ever engaging him. His resistance to the Ottomans made him a temporary hero to some in Europe, especially in Hungary and the Papal States, who saw him as a defender of Christianity against Islamic expansion. But they did not endorse his methods openly. Instead, they tolerated them when useful and condemned them when convenient. Vlad knew this and never relied on their approval. He expected betrayal as a rule and acted first to prevent it from striking him inside his realm. No one was safe from suspicion. He kept no true allies, only temporary collaborators, and he rotated his trusted circle, often ensuring that none became too powerful or too secure in their position. His guards and administrators lived under constant scrutiny, knowing that the prince watched everything and forgave nothing, and so they obeyed, and so the machinery of terror remained well-oiled and effective. He moved his court to various fortresses to maintain unpredictability and to keep potential plotters from gaining any advantage. One of his key strongholds was the fortress of Ponary, perched high in the mountains. Rebuilt with forced labor from captured boyards and peasants, it became both a military base and a symbol of his reign. A place built on the backs of those he broke, a monument to his rule carved from stone and fear. As reports of his cruelty spread, many of them documented by Saxon merchants, Hungarian chroniclers, and Ottoman officials, the man began to transform into a myth, not because of exaggeration alone, but because the facts were already so disturbing that they lent themselves to legend. Travelers spoke of a ruler who dined among the impaled, who drank while watching men scream, who punished with a kind of creative violence that turned horror into art. Yet beneath these acts was a strategy. Vlad used brutality to cover for a lack of military resources. He knew he could not fight wars like the great empires, but he could make the cost of invasion unbearable. He knew he could not rule like a wise king beloved by his people, but he could eliminate every voice of dissent until only silence remained. In doing this, he turned fear into his greatest asset and his cruelty into a foundation of power over time. The name Vlad became inseparable from the method of impalement, and his memory was tied not to policies or speeches or reforms, but to the image of a ruler whose wrath was as inevitable as the sunrise and as merciless as the winter wind. He did not seek love. He did not seek respect. He sought control, absolute and unshakable, and he built it not with gold, not with treaties, but with wood sharpened to a deadly point. And so the path that began with political exile and foreign hostagehood ended with the rise of one of history's most terrifying figures, not because of madness, but because of cold strategy, not because he was cursed, but because he made a choice to rule through dread, to carve his legacy into the minds of those who would live under him, and into the annals of history that would never forget him. He had become more than a man. He had become a warning, a name that even centuries later conjured images of unspeakable pain and unrelenting power. This was not the work of myth alone, but the product of a lifetime spent building fear, brick by brick, stake by stake, and death by death. When Vlad the Impaler secured his throne again in Wallachia during the mid-1450s, he did not simply ascend as a claimant to rule. He returned as a man forged in bitterness, betrayal, and calculation. Wallachia was a principality locked between greater empires to the south. The Ottomans commanded unmatched military strength, and to the north, Hungary maintained political interest in the region. Caught between these two, Vlad had to not only survive, but impose his dominance over a fragmented and unstable land. His early acts of leadership revealed the architecture of his vision. He would not govern as others had, with negotiation, compromise, or appeals to the elite classes. Instead, his method was singular, and clear power would be held. Through dread, fear would become the foundation of authority, and violence would be his language of control. Following his brutal cleansing of the boyars, Vlad turned his attention to Wallachia.'s fragile social structure. Towns had little trust in princely power, and many merchants were more loyal to Hungarian or Saxon trade partners than to their own ruler. So Vlad restructured economic laws with severe enforcement mechanisms. He demanded absolute obedience and eliminated those who defied new regulations without hesitation. This was not administration, it was purification, and each act of cruelty sent a message to those watching. He also reimagined justice in Wallachia, not as a process, but as a consequence. Punishments under his rule were not hidden behind walls, they were displayed publicly. A thief might be impaled beside a main road, a dishonest merchant left on a sharpened stake in the marketplace to rot. Before others, these spectacles were not isolated incidents, but orchestrated performances, designed to imprint terror in the minds of the populace. To Vlad, loyalty was the highest currency, and betrayal, the most unforgivable crime. But betrayal to him included disobedience, hesitation, or even suspicion of resistance, and as the ranks of those punished grew, so too did the silence of the public. People stopped questioning his laws, not because they agreed with them, but because they feared what happened to those who resisted. His enforcement of order extended to the clergy as well. Wallachia was a deeply religious society, yet Vlad did not bow to the authority of the church unless it suited him. Some monks and priests who challenged his edicts or questioned his policies disappeared entirely or were executed. His stance was not anti-religious, but it was clear the church would not dictate terms in his court. The altar served the throne, not the other way around. Vlad's harsh approach to governance also extended into economic policy. He recognized that foreign merchants, particularly the Saxons from Transylvanian cities like Brasov, held economic leverage over his principality. They operated semi-independently, maintained strong connections to rival powers, and often defied local taxation rules to challenge them. Vlad imposed harsh levies and punishments, confiscated property, and executed those who resisted his control. In Brasov, a once thriving economic partner, he burned entire villages and impaled dozens as a message to others. By using extreme measures, Vlad recalibrated the boundaries of leadership in Wallachia. He made his rule less about law and more about will, the will of one man who demanded unity. Even if that unity was achieved through violence, the people under his control came to understand that under Vlad there would be no negotiation, no debate, and no forgiveness. Those who followed his rules were left in peace. Those who stepped out of line were eliminated quickly and often publicly. In 1460 and 1461, this model of governance would be tested on an international scale as tensions with the Ottoman Empire escalated. The Ottomans had supported his rise only conditionally, and Vlad's refusal to pay the required tribute to Sultan Mehmed II was a direct provocation. It was not a negotiation tactic, it was a declaration of defiance, and one that would lead to one of the most violent campaigns of his rule. Rather than waiting for Ottoman retaliation, Vlad crossed the Danube and launched a series of surprise raids into Ottoman-held territory in Bulgaria. These were not military skirmishes, but full-scale campaigns of devastation. Villages were burned, populations massacred, crops destroyed, and resistance annihilated. He ordered the impalement of thousands of Turks, both combatants and civilians, as he left behind fields littered with bodies. One of the most infamous accounts from this campaign comes from the Ottoman chroniclers themselves. When Sultan Mehmed's forces advanced into Wallachia in retaliation, they encountered a horrifying scene. Near Targovekt, a massive field filled with the impaled bodies of over 20,000 people, arranged methodically in rows left as a grotesque warning. It was not only psychological warfare, but a demonstration of what Vlad considered power. It was the price of trespass, and the message was clear. These acts, though horrifying, were calculated. Vlad knew that he could not match the Ottoman Empire in open battle. He could not repel a full invasion by force of arms alone, but he could break their spirit slow, their advance, and destabilize their momentum through terror. His goal was not to defeat the Sultan in the traditional sense, but to make the cost of advancing too high to bear. And it worked for a time. The Ottomans withdrew, unable to secure a victory. Mehmed himself reportedly turned back after seeing the scale of Vlad's resistance, and the demoralizing spectacle left behind. This moment solidified Vlad's infamy across Europe and the Middle East. Christian leaders hailed him as a defender of the faith, albeit a gruesome one, while Ottoman accounts framed him as a brutal madman. But all agreed on one point: his methods were extreme and unforgettable. Back in Wallachia, Vlad had become both feared and admired for his resistance. He represented a leader who could stand against foreign domination at great cost. But internally, his subjects continued to suffer under the unrelenting grip of his rule. There was no balance between sovereignty and compassion, only enforcement and execution. Even those who supported him lived in fear, because his wrath did not follow consistent logic. Suspicion alone was often enough to seal one's fate. The very tools that secured his power also began to isolate him over time. Foreign allies became cautious. Hungarian leaders began to distance themselves, fearing his unpredictability and brutality, and internal resentment among surviving nobles and rival families started to build again. The problem for Vlad was not just that he ruled through fear, but that fear without loyalty eventually leads to rebellion. This tension would continue to escalate in the years to come as Vlad's world closed in around him. But in these years, between 1456 and 1461, he had already become the figure history would immortalize. Not a king, not a statesman, but a ruler so brutal that his name would become legend. Vlad the Impaler had turned himself into a symbol of terror, a sovereign whose reign was measured not by reforms or treaties, but by the number of bodies left in his wake. This was how he became the relentless monster, remembered in chronicles across Europe and the East, not because of madness or chaos, but through deliberate strategy, driven by vengeance, forged in betrayal, and executed with cold resolve. By the time the 1460s arrived, Vlad the Impaler was no longer a man struggling for control. He had become the control. Every act, every punishment, every political maneuver was carefully calculated to reinforce his singular rule over Wallachia. There were no shared thrones, no councils of advisors with real power. The land bent to his will, not through diplomacy or natural loyalty, but through the ever-present threat of impalement. This was not simply the rule of a tyrant for the sake of cruelty. In Vlad's eyes, this was order. The forests of the Carpathians, long plagued by banditry and civil unrest, were suddenly quiet. Merchants could travel without fear of robbers. Villages that had known decades of instability now experienced a forced form of peace. But it came at an unthinkable cost. The stability was soaked in blood, and the silence was achieved not through harmony, but through the extinguishing of voices. Stories began to filter beyond Wallachia's border stales of punishments, so elaborate they seemed impossible. Diplomats from Saxony and Hungary returned home, shaken by what they had witnessed. Even hardened soldiers recounted the horror of approaching towns and smelling death before seeing it. Forests were said to have been turned into fields of corpses, each body impaled on long wooden stakes, arranged in perfect rows, left to rot in the sun as warnings. And they were warnings, deliberately positioned where any traveler, ally or enemy could see them. There are accounts, perhaps exaggerated but rooted in real patterns, describing entire villages being wiped out after minor acts of defiance. One chronicler from Brasov recorded that a group of merchants who cheated Wallachian traders were not merely fined or imprisoned. They were skinned, their remains displayed publicly, and their goods confiscated. Vlad did not simply punish treachery, he made it an event, an example, and a ritual. And yet, among the people, reactions were mixed. Some feared him beyond reason. Others, paradoxically, admired him. He was a ruler who did not tolerate corruption, who punished theft, who resisted foreign domination. For many peasants, life under Vlad meant fewer threats from bandits or greedy boyars, but the safety was brittle, like glass stretched to thin. At any moment, a perceived betrayal or mistake could mean death. Even speaking against him carried the risk of torture or worse. There was no appeal, no hope of clemency. His relationship with the church was equally complex. While Vlad presented himself as a defender of Christianity, particularly against the growing threat of Ottoman expansion, his methods horrified even the most devout clerics. A report from a papal envoy described Vlad as both a protector of Christendom and a butcher of men. These contradictions would become part of his legacy. He was not easily labeled as good or evil. He was a paradox made flesh, brutal yet organized, pious yet monstrous, strategic yet sadistic. Perhaps one of the most infamous episodes of his reign was what came to be known as the Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, during renewed conflict with the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia with a vast army. Expecting a swift campaign, the Sultan's forces pushed deep into Vlad's territory. What they found instead was psychological warfare on an unimaginable scale. Thousands of stakes dotted the landscape outside Targovekt, each one bearing the remains of Ottoman prisoners, traitors, or criminals. The sheer number and stench of the bodies unnerved even hardened warriors. Contemporary sources claim the Sultan himself was so disturbed by the sight that he abandoned his campaign, retreating to Constantinople. While this may have been embellished, the strategy itself was real. Vlad understood fear better than any of his contemporaries. He understood that horror was a weapon, one that didn't require armies or wealth to deploy. In this, he was centuries ahead of his time. He had weaponized narrative, using the rumors of his cruelty as a deterrent, spreading the idea of Vlad the Monster more effectively than any formal decree or diplomatic letter. Back home, however, his enemies were never far. The boyars, though weakened, still plotted. The church, alarmed by his brutality, offered only conditional support. And neighboring leaders, particularly Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, began to see Vlad less as an ally and more as a liability. Rumors of betrayal began to circulate. Accusations were made that Vlad was conspiring with the Ottomans, despite his violent opposition to them. Whether these were politically motivated lies or the result of real diplomatic confusion remains uncertain. In 1462, Corvinus had him arrested. It was a sudden reversal for a man who had ruled with impunity. Now imprisoned in Hungary, Vlad spent over a decade in captivity. During this time, he faded from political relevance, but his legend continued to grow. Tales of his past reign spread like wildfire across Europe. Some viewed him as a cautionary tale of power gone mad. Others saw in him a dark savior man who had protected Christian lands against Muslim conquest, no matter how grisly his methods. But Vlad was not done. After years of captivity, he was released and allowed to return to Wallachia for a final attempt at power. The region was once again in disarray, caught between Ottoman aggression and Hungarian interests. Vlad saw his chance to reclaim what had once been his. But the Wallachia he returned to was not the one he had ruled with iron and flame. His support was weak, and his enemies more numerous than ever. He reigned for only a brief time before disappearing from the historical record. It is believed he was killed in battle around 1476, his body decapitated and sent to the Ottomans as proof of his death. No triumph, no throne, no redemption. And yet, Vlad the Impaler had already ensured his survival not as a man, but as a myth. His name would live on not through royal bloodlines or nation-building, but through the stories whispered in taverns and chronicled in scrolls. Stories of a man who drank blood, who dined among corpses, who impaled entire armies to maintain control. These legends would cross centuries and borders, eventually inspiring Bram Stoker's Dracula and becoming embedded in pop culture. But behind the fiction was always the truth: a boy taken hostage, a prince betrayed, a man who ruled through cruelty because kindness had never offered him anything but pain. Vlad the Impaler was not a vampire. He was something far more real. A man who learned that in a world of shifting loyalties and foreign invaders, terror could be more enduring than trust, and perhaps more intoxicating than power itself. As the second reign of Vlad the Impaler moved toward its closing years, the territories of Wallachia no longer operated under systems of negotiation reform or shared governance. The entire structure of rule had gradually shifted into something deeply personal and violently direct. Vlad had fully centralized power in his hands and shaped it according to his own perception of justice and control. With no space left for compromise, debate, or forgiveness, his rule was no longer a function of nobility, but an extension of his trauma, his ambition, and his obsession with punishment. The region had suffered decades of instability before Vlad rose again to power, and he now believed that the only path to stability was through calculated terror. Every noble, every merchant, every soldier and every farmer lived beneath the looming reality that loyalty alone would not guarantee safety. Absolute fear became the most reliable tool for preventing betrayal. The boyars, who had once orchestrated the deaths of his family members and manipulated the thrones of Wallachia, were now hunted, stripped of their status, and often executed in public displays of violence without ceremony or mercy. Beyond the nobility, Vlad's reach extended across every layer of society. Entire villages faced collective punishment when accused of harboring thieves or evading taxes. The stakes were no longer symbolic warnings, they became the legal framework under which justice was enacted. Throughout the countryside, wooden forests of impaled bodies began to appear, marking sites of executions that were meant to be remembered, not for days or weeks, but for generations. Vlad believed that when memory failed, the earth itself would remember where the lessons were planted. There were no courts, no juries, no systems of appeals. Vlad's law existed in his command, and punishment was immediate. For offenses as small as stealing bread or spreading rumors, peasants could be impaled, tortured or burned, and none of it required witnesses or written testimony. One voice, his voice, was enough. This method of rule created a form of distorted stability. Wallachia saw a temporary drop in crime and internal disputes, largely because no one dared act at all without certainty that they would not be accused of disloyalty. Foreign observers began to record what they witnessed and what they heard. The German Saxons, who had once benefited from trade privileges, now found themselves at odds with Vlad. Their merchants were arrested, their caravans were seized, and their citizens were accused of espionage. Some were executed, others were left to rot in dungeons. Foreign chroniclers began to describe Vlad as a tyrant and a madman, using images and stories that often blurred fact and exaggeration. But these reports spread quickly across Central and Western Europe, contributing to the growing legend of a ruler unlike any other. In Hungary, the court of Matthias Corvinus received letters and petitions from both noble refugees and foreign diplomats, describing the brutal practices unfolding in Wallachia. Even allies of Vlad hesitated to defend him publicly. They feared that association with his name would permanently stain their own positions. Corvinus, who had once supported Vlad, strategically distanced himself and eventually took steps that led to Vlad's imprisonment. This marked a significant turn in Vlad's political life and cast him once again into the role of a prisoner. But even while imprisoned, Vlad's reputation did not weaken. Stories continued to circulate and take root. Some described how he had impaled thousands of people in a single day. Others claimed he enjoyed dining among corpses or watching executions while eating, though many of these claims were shaped by foreign propaganda or embellished over time. They were not without origin. Vlad had intentionally fostered this myth because he believed it was the most effective form of psychological warfare to deter foreign invasion and internal rebellion. During this period of captivity, his homeland fell again into internal struggle, and competing factions fought for power without clear resolution. Eventually, with the political situation becoming more chaotic, Vlad was once again released and offered support for a brief return to power. However, this final reign was short-lived and less impactful than his earlier campaigns. Despite returning to the throne, the Wallachia he inherited was fractured and unstable, and his hold over it was far less certain than before. In the winter of 1476, Vlad led a military campaign to reclaim full control over Wallachia. But during this campaign he was ambushed and killed. His head was severed and sent to the court of the Ottoman Sultan as proof of his death, a deeply symbolic gesture that closed the final chapter of his life and reign. He died as he had lived, amidst conflict, violence, and betrayal. His body was buried in secret, and over time the exact location of his remains was lost to history. The long-term legacy of Vlad the Impaler was forged not merely through the number of lives he took, but through the structure of fear he constructed and the deliberate performance of cruelty that came to define his rule. His policies were not shaped by philosophy or faith or progressive strategy, but by vengeance, trauma, and an unshakable belief that control must be absolute. His rule is remembered not for the institutions he built, but for the absence of them, not for prosperity, but for silence imposed through horror. Yet despite this, Vlad was not forgotten. In fact, his memory grew larger over time, not only in Wallachian and Romanian history, but in European cultural memory as well. He became the subject of pamphlets, poems, folklore, and later, fictional transformations that took his already infamous name and turned it into the foundation of literary monsters. The most famous of these was the character of Count Dracula, created centuries later, and loosely inspired by the real-life figure of Vlad the Impaler, whose legacy of violence had already elevated him into near-mythical status. In historical terms, Vlad remains a subject of intense debate. Scholars continue to examine how much of his cruelty was propaganda, and how much was policy, how much of his legend was fact, and how much was shaped by those who feared him. Those questions remain difficult to answer with certainty, because so many of the primary sources available come from his enemies. Yet even with the possibility of exaggeration, what is clear is that Vlad's impact was deep, lasting, and unique in the annals of European history. As segment 2 draws to a close, we are left with the image of a man who came from tragedy, ruled through trauma, and left behind a land that bore the scars of his methods for generations. His desire to control, to retaliate, and to erase weakness from his world made him into one of the most feared figures of his era. And whether remembered as tyrant ruler, protector, or executioner, Vlad the Impaler remains one of the most disturbing and unforgettable characters in the violent theater of medieval power. The bloody rise of Vlad the Impaler Dracula begins in the fractured lands of 15th century Eastern Europe, a region constantly pulled between empires, internal rivalries, and the endless struggle for sovereignty. Wallachia, the principality that would be central to Vlad's life, was a land marked by political instability, foreign occupation, and a nobility more loyal to its own power than to any ruler. Vlad's story cannot be understood without grasping the brutal world into which he was born and the dynastic tensions that surrounded his bloodline. Vlad was born in the year 1428 or 1432. The exact year remains debated by historians. He was the second son of Vlad, the second, also known as Vlad, Dracul meaning dragon, a title derived from his induction into the Order of the Dragon, a Catholic chivalric order founded by Sigismund, King of Hungary, and the Holy Roman Emperor. The order's mission was to defend Christian Europe from the rising threat of the Ottoman Turks. Thus, from the very beginning, Vlad's identity was entangled in warfare, religion, and dynastic ambition. Vlad's early years were shaped by political hostage-taking in 1442 or 43. His father agreed to send him and his younger brother Radu to the Ottoman court in Adrianople as hostages. This was not an unusual practice. It was a diplomatic measure meant to ensure the loyalty of his father to the Sultan Murad II. For the young Vlad, however, the experience would leave lasting scars. He was surrounded by a foreign culture, taught their customs and language, but never allowed to forget his status as a political pawn. During this time, Radu grew fond of the Ottoman court and eventually converted to Islam, aligning himself with the Turks and building favor with the Sultan. Vlad, in contrast, harbored a growing resentment toward the Ottomans and all those who submitted to their influence. His years in captivity forged his mistrust, his obsession with loyalty, and his unforgiving sense of justice. The ideological divisions that would later define his rule began to take shape during this captivity. While Vlad was still held by the Ottomans, his father Vlad Dracul was deposed and eventually murdered by Wallachian boyars, those powerful nobles who often played kingmaker in the region. His older half brother Mircea was brutally executed by being buried alive. The betrayal by his own nobility and the deaths of his father and brother would later justify in Vlad's mind the extreme punishments he would mete out against the boyar class. Vlad's return to Wallachia was not the result of a peaceful succession, but a temporary power shift in the wider struggle between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. In 1448, with support from the Ottomans, Vlad briefly took the throne of Wallachia after the death of the reigning voivode Vladislav II, but this rule was short-lived, and he was forced into exile once again. What followed was a decade of wandering political maneuvering and struggle for power. During these years, Vlad traveled through Moldavia, Hungary, and Transylvania, seeking support for his claim to the Wallachian throne. He lived in the shadows of other courts, observed alliances and betrayals, and built a network of support among those who wished to see a strong hand rule Wallachia. Vlad's opportunity came in 1456 when the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, seeking a reliable buffer state between his realm and the Ottoman Empire, lent his support to Vlad's cause with military backing and the shifting tides of local power. Vlad returned to Wallachia and reclaimed the throne by defeating Dan III. The current ruler, Vlad III, now voivode of Wallachia, began his rule with a brutal message. He invited many of the local boyars to an Easter feast in 1457 under the guise of celebration. He had the older nobles impaled, and the younger ones marched to the city of Ponari to build his fortress. This was not merely an act of vengeance, but a calculated political statement. Vlad would not be a puppet of the nobility, nor a ruler To be trifled with, he would govern through fear, discipline, and merciless. Just as the policy of impalement, which would give him his infamous name, was not just a method of execution, it was a public performance of power. Those who opposed Vlad, who disobeyed his laws or threatened his authority, were impaled on tall wooden stakes, left to die slowly and visibly in front of the population. Impalement was terrifying. It sent a clear message that order would be maintained at any cost. The cities and roads of Wallachia under Vlad's rule soon became lined with the bodies of criminals, conspirators, and dissenters. The brutality shocked foreign visitors, but within Wallachia, it created a grim form of stability. Theft, decreased, corruption was punished, and the common people, according to some accounts, lived without fear of banditry or exploitation from the aristocracy. At the same time, Vlad's foreign policy was defined by his hostility toward the Ottoman Empire. Though he'd once been supported by the Sultan and raised in his court, Vlad saw the Ottomans as a threat to his land and his people. He refused to pay tribute, defied their authority, and prepared Wallachia for war. The confrontation came in 1461, when Vlad refused to continue paying the annual tribute to the Sultan Mehmed II. Instead, he launched a brutal night raid across the Danube, attacking Turkish settlements, burning villages, and massacring entire populations. According to some chronicles, over 20,000 were killed and impaled along the riverbanks as a message to the advancing Ottoman army. The campaign was one of terror, not just of war. Vlad's goal was to frighten the Ottomans, demoralize their soldiers, and make them think twice before invading Wallachia. This tactic reached its grim climax in what would later be called the Forest of the Impaled. When Sultan Mehmed advanced into Wallachia and reached the capital Targovist, he found not a standing army, but a field of 20,000 impaled corpses. According to the accounts of Greek chroniclers and Turkish envoys, the scene was so horrifying that it shook the morale of the Ottoman soldiers and the Sultan himself. By the end of this campaign, Vlad's reputation as the Impaler was sealed both in Western and Eastern records. He was seen as a tyrant, a butcher, and yet also a ruler who resisted Ottoman expansion and imposed a severe but functional order within his realm. His tactics shocked but also impressed European leaders who saw in him a defender of Christianity and an example of harsh leadership in the face of overwhelming pressure. But power in Wallachia was always unstable, and Vlad's rule was no exception. Internal enemies, foreign threats, and shifting alliances would soon challenge his hold on the throne again, and his final fall from power would mark the beginning of a different legacy, one that blurred history and myth into the figure later known as Dracula. This marks the end of part 1 of chapter 3. In the next part we will explore Vlad's later campaigns, his second fall from power, his imprisonment, and the transformation of his name from a historical prince into a legend of horror and fascination across Europe and the modern world as war's fires swept across Wallachia and the political and geographic ravaged lands about it. A new and profoundly unsettling type of warfare began to emerge, shaped not by tradition or honor, but by naked calculating terror, and it was given its most infamous and enduring expression by Vlad the Impaler. It was not the jousting on open fields of thousands of men that came to characterize his rise, but nor was it the grandeur of diplomacy and strategy, but rather it was the use of fear itself as a weapon, the cold and deliberate use of psychological torment to break the will of his enemies. Before steel was ever unsheathed or bloodshed upon the open field, he was not so much a military commander as he was a dark maestro of horror who understood with ghastly clarity that terror could be far more potent than the sword or the spear. This transformation of war into an instrument of terror began with deliberate acts, not driven by immediate military necessity, but cleverly crafted as symbolic messages. Every death during Vlad's rule, especially the public ones, was staged as an example, as a visible menace. Sent over frontiers to friends and foes alike, the killings were not aimless acts of vengeance. They were scripted performances performed with chilling regularity. Bodies were not hidden, but left sometimes literally on tall wooden stakes, set in gruesome rows and spirals that could extend for miles. These were abandoned to rot in plain sight, not to eliminate the streets of traitors, but to fill the hearts of others with silence and fear. As the winds carried the stench of death over the fields, it was said that even the birds fell silent above Vlad's territories. One of the most horrific examples of this strategy was during the march of the vast Ottoman army of Sultan Mehmed II, whose legions marched up to Targovist. expecting resistance from walls or from woods, but not what they encountered in the valley before the city. What they found waiting for them was not an army, but a cemetery more horrific than any battlefield. The valley was littered with more than 20,000 dead men, women and children, impaled and standing upright, in rows like some macabre monument to agony. Some were rotting already, others still groaned. Weakly impaled but alive in cold geometric array, the message could not have been clearer. The invaders were not only not wanted, they would be annihilated, not physically but spiritually. Sultan Mehmed halted, and gazed upon the atrocity before him. Grim warriors at his side stood transfixed, some gagged, others wept, and then the unimaginable happened. The great Ottoman army retreated not through absence of force, but because it had encountered face to face a horror greater than war. But Vlad's fear was not limited to invaders alone. It spilled into the very heart of Wallachia itself. When he came back to the throne, he did not forget past treachery, especially by the powerful noble class known as boyars. They had made kingship their plaything for centuries, weakening the throne with intrigue, treachery, and factionalism. So when Vlad invited hundreds of these boyars to a grand Easter banquet at his court, it seemed like a conciliatory gesture at first. Instead, it turned out to be one of the bloodiest purges in Wallachia's history. Many were taken into custody in the middle of the banquet, impaled on the spot, or rounded up under heavy guard to forced labor camps in the Carpathians, where they worked themselves to death from exhaustion, their bodies buried casually in the very foundations of Vlad's new fortresses. These actions served a dual purpose. They punished treason and rebuilt the kingdom on the skeletons of those who had torn it apart before. His rage then turned against the Saxon traders of Transylvania, who had favored his political adversaries and disrupted Wallachian trade routes to destroy their influence. Vlad leveled cities at their expense, killing those who resisted him and shipping the dead back in carts as brutal gestures of retaliation. When diplomacy collapsed or neutrality was threatened, even peripherally, Vlad acted with immediate and disproportionate force. A rumor of disloyalty could lead to a public hanging. A defection to one could devastate a village. His control of the region as trade arteries became another field, one in which silence was bought not by gold but by fear, by upsetting the system of trade and punishing communities with ties to his rivals. He further distanced his opposition and drove home the lesson that prosperity under his rule came only through absolute obedience outside. The actions of Vlad appeared monstrous, and in many respects they were, but his cruelty was not the product of an unthinking brutality. It was informed by a logic one, drawn both from medieval statecraft and military necessity. Within a country always exposed to larger empires, Wallachia required a ruler who might inspire loyalty, but one who also inspired fear to deter corruption, to keep things off the backs of others, to keep out invaders, and to enforce the law. Vlad understood that terror begat order, and for a while it worked. Crime fell, justice came swiftly and always, and even common peasants who trembled at his rage admitted that for the first time their lords no longer stole from them under Vlad. No one stole because the cost of stealing was not a trial or a fine. It was being put on the end of a spike at the village gate, with the thief's name carved into the wood for all to see. European courts took cognizance as tales of Vlad's reign spread among merchant travelers and ambassadors, and though numerous chroniclers were morally appalled by him, others were impressed by what he had achieved. The Pope heard contradictory reports, some applauding his resistance to the Ottomans, others warning about his methods. But across the continent, there was an aura that grew around the Prince of Wallachia, who defied a mighty empire and repelled it, not with armies but with horror. His legend was growing, even as he was still alive, a creature of fascination and terror, who had twisted history itself through cruel calculation, and whose rise was heralded not with pageantry, but with the silent screams of those whose bodies lined the roads to his capital. But even the most formidable fortress built upon terror would be forced to face its limitations someday, for terror breeds resistance and estrangement, and in due course it would be these very traits that would pave the way towards betrayal, revolt, and final destruction. This concludes part 2 of chapter 3. In the next part we will see how the same strategies that elevated Vlad to unprecedented heights started sowing the seeds of internal resistance, global disapprobation, and erosion of the blood-soaked empire he had so relentlessly established. Vlad the Impaler's rise to power in the mid-15th century was not merely a result of battlefield success, but a complex and calculated campaign designed to establish absolute authority over Wallachia. a land long marked by political fragmentation and external threats. Vlad understood that his survival depended on consolidating power through a mixture of military prowess, political strategy, and psychological control. His approach to warfare was unique for its time in an era when armies met openly on fields and sieges. To find campaigns, Vlad shifted the focus toward irregular tactics, made use of the challenging Carpathian geography, striking at enemy supply lines, and isolated units with swift raids, then vanishing before a counterattack could be organized. This strategy allowed him to conserve his forces and wear down larger Ottoman armies that sought to absorb Wallachia into their expanding empire. The Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II were determined to bring Wallachia firmly into their domain. Their repeated invasions posed a relentless threat. But Vlad met these with more than just traditional military resistance. His response incorporated brutal reprisals and terror tactics that blurred the lines between warfare and psychological operations by leaving behind grisly scenes, such as the Forest of the Impaled. Vlad created a message that resonated far beyond the battlefield, instilling fear not only in enemy troops, but also discouraging local collaborators and traitors within his own lands. In addition to external threats, Vlad faced persistent challenges from the boyar nobility. The boyards were powerful landowners whose allegiances often shifted between competing foreign powers and local factions. This fragmentation undermined centralized authority and threatened Vlad's efforts at reform and control. Unlike many rulers who sought compromise, Vlad took a harsher stance toward the boyars. Perceiving them as obstacles to unity, he systematically eliminated those who resisted his use of deception. Inviting boyars to feasts, only to imprison or execute them publicly, was a deliberate show of force designed to discourage dissent. These actions sent shockwaves through Wallachian society. Nobles and peasants alike came to understand that disloyalty was met with not just death, but with public humiliation and torture. This reign of terror forced many to comply out of fear rather than genuine allegiance, but it did bring a measure of order to a region previously ravaged by internal conflict. The brutality was a form of governance that ensured stability, though at great human cost. Vlad also focused on strengthening the defensive infrastructure of Wallachia. Central to this was the restoration and fortification of Ponari Castle, nestled high in the Fagaris Mountains. The castle served both as a strategic military stronghold and a symbol of Vlad's determination to protect his principality. Its imposing presence deterred enemy advances and provided a secure base for planning raids and counterattacks. The location of Ponari made it difficult for large armies to besiege, and its walls were reinforced to withstand prolonged assault. Militarily, Vlad was pragmatic. He adapted to changing circumstances, using both conventional forces and guerrilla warfare. His knowledge of the terrain allowed him to stage ambushes and surprise attacks that maximized damage while minimizing risk to his troops. At the same time, he maintained a network of spies and informants to monitor internal threats and external movements. This intelligence gathering was vital in a region where allegiances were unstable and betrayals frequent. Vlad's use of terror extended beyond military and political rivals. He was known to enforce harsh justice on common criminals and those who violated his laws through public executions and severe punishments. He sought to create a culture of obedience within his realm. His legal code was strict and his enforcement uncompromising. This approach earned him fear and respect among his subjects, though it also bred resentment and suffering. The reputation of Vlad the Impaler spread quickly across Europe. Envoys and diplomats who traveled through the region carried tales of his merciless methods. His name became synonymous with cruelty, but also with fierce resistance against the Ottomans. Dual perception complicated diplomatic relations. Vlad was simultaneously feared as a barbarian and admired as a defender of Christendom. His ability to maintain independence for Wallachia, even briefly, was noted by foreign courts and chroniclers. Despite his successes, Vlad's harsh methods made lasting alliances difficult. His unpredictability and reputation for cruelty caused mistrust even among potential allies. The Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, initially a supporter, grew increasingly cautious of Vlad's extreme tactics. Rumors and accusations of betrayal circulated in the volatile political environment, further isolating. Vlad diplomacy became a minefield, and Vlad relied more heavily on military force and terror to maintain his position. Vlad's legacy is complex. His bloody rise to power demonstrated a leader willing to use every tool at his disposal to secure his realm in a time of great instability. The methods he employed were brutal and effective. They came with heavy costs in human suffering and political isolation. His name endures not only because of the terror he inspired, but because of his ability to shape Wallachian history during a pivotal era. This concludes part 3 of chapter 3. In the next part, we will examine the eventual decline of Vlad's power, his final years, and how the transformation of his persona into legend began to take shape both within and beyond Wallachia. Despite years of consolidating power, Vlad the Impaler's hold over Wallachia remained fragile. The brutal methods he employed achieved a degree of order and deterred invaders, but created many enemies both within and outside his borders. Political intrigue, conspiracies, and shifting alliances constantly threatened his position. The boyar class, though weakened, still posed challenges. Their loyalty was fickle, and many sought to undermine Vlad whenever possible. The Ottoman Empire continued to exert pressure, eager to solidify control over the strategically important principality. Wallachia was a key buffer zone between Ottoman lands and Central Europe, and controlling it meant easier access and influence. Vlad's fierce resistance delayed Ottoman ambitions but could not prevent them indefinitely. The repeated campaigns drained Wallachian resources and tested the endurance of its people. In addition to external threats, Vlad also faced increasing isolation internationally. His former ally Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, grew wary of Vlad's extreme and unpredictable behavior. The Hungarian monarchy was a crucial regional power, and without its support, Vlad's ability to maintain power was significantly compromised. Political calculations led Corvinus to view Vlad as more of a liability than an asset. Rumors circulated, suggesting Vlad was involved in negotiations or even conspiracies with the Ottomans, though historical evidence remains inconclusive. Such rumors further damaged his diplomatic standing. In 1462, Vlad was eventually captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned. The reasons behind his arrest are debated among historians, but it marked a sudden and dramatic reversal of fortune for the once powerful prince. He spent over a decade in captivity, removed from the political arena. Though imprisoned, Vlad's legend continued to grow. Tales of his ruthlessness spread, and his image as a fearsome ruler transcended his absence from power. Upon release, Vlad attempted to reclaim his throne in a Wallachia altered by years of conflict and shifting power dynamics. The political landscape was more hostile, his support diminished, and his enemies more numerous. His return to power was brief, marked by renewed violence and instability before his disappearance from historical records. Around 1476, it is believed Vlad died in battle. His death was brutal, his body reportedly decapitated and sent to the Ottomans as proof of his demise. Though his life ended without lasting triumph, Vlad the Impaler secured a place in history through his unique blend of military skill, political ruthlessness, and psychological warfare. His rule exemplified the harsh realities of 15th century Eastern Europe, a region caught between empires and internal divisions. His legacy is inseparable from the terror he wielded, but also from the complex political challenges he navigated. Over time, the figure of Vlad the Impaler transcended history, evolving into a symbol in folklore, literature, and popular culture. Most famously inspiring Bram Stoker's Dracula, this transformation took his legacy far beyond the political realm into myth and horror. The historical Vlad was a prince shaped by brutal circumstances, a man whose methods reflected the violence of his age rather than supernatural evil. Understanding Vlad requires separating myth from fact, recognizing the historical context of his actions and the geopolitical pressures that shaped his decisions. His bloody rise was a product of necessity, ambition, and survival in a volatile world where cruelty was often a tool of governance. As history looks back on Vlad the Impaler, it sees not only a figure of fear, but a ruler whose reign offers insight into the complexities of power in a turbulent era. This chapter concludes here. In the next chapter, we will explore the enduring impact of Vlad the Impaler on European culture, how his story was told and retold, and how the man behind the legend continues to fascinate and inspire. Vlad the Impaler's death did not mark an end to his influence on history. Instead, it initiated a complex and evolving legacy whose layers continue to be unraveled by historians, folklorists, and cultural scholars. His life and reign laid the foundation for a mixture of historical accounts, legends, and myths that blend fact and fiction in ways that have profoundly shaped collective memory across centuries and continents. Contemporary reports of Vlad's rule spread extensively throughout Europe fueled by detailed accounts from envoys, diplomats, and travelers who had either witnessed his brutal methods firsthand or heard vivid descriptions from those who had. These narratives portrayed him as a figure synonymous with cruelty and terror, a ruler who employed exceptionally harsh punishments, including the infamous practice of impalement. The use of public executions served not only to enforce justice according to his vision, but also to act as calculated performances designed to instill widespread fear and maintain a firm grip on order. These deliberate acts of terror forged an enduring image of a merciless leader whose reputation transcended national borders and persisted across generations, embedding itself deeply in the European collective imagination. Nevertheless, Vlad's legacy defies simple categorization. His role as a resolute defender of Wallachia against the encroaching Ottoman Empire was acknowledged even by some of his most determined adversaries. While his tactics were unquestionably severe, they were often interpreted as measures of necessity during a period marked by relentless conflict, political fragmentation, and pervasive insecurity. His determined opposition to Ottoman expansion cast him in the role of guardian of Christian Europe, a designation which complicates the common perception of Vlad as a mere tyrant or villain. As time advanced, the blending of folklore and myth with historical record became more pronounced. The moniker Dracula, which originated from his father Vlad Dracula's membership in the Order of the Dragon, created symbolic associations, linking Vlad to dragons, darkness, and supernatural forces. This nexus gave rise to a vast array of legends portraying Vlad as a vampire or bloodthirsty fiend, embodying evil and dread. The metamorphosis of Vlad from a historical prince into a Gothic icon exemplifies the powerful influence of narrative in transforming historical personalities into enduring cultural archetypes. The 19th century witnessed the most significant reshaping of Vlad's image through Bram Stoker's seminal novel Dracula. This literary work drew heavily from the macabre stories surrounding Vlad the Impaler, weaving them into a fictional character destined to become one of the most enduring and influential figures in horror literature. The fictional Dracula captured global imaginations, embedding Vlad's legacy deeply within popular culture, creating a symbolic figure far removed from the political and military realities of medieval Wallachia. Despite the fictionalized embellishments, scholars continue rigorous investigations into the historical Vlad, focusing on situating his reign within the broader context of medieval statecraft, warfare, and social order. His rule offers invaluable insight into the dynamics of power, consolidation, and control. Through terror in a volatile frontier region, sandwiched between great empires, the deliberate use of fear as a political instrument highlights how medieval rulers like Vlad manipulated psychological warfare to suppress dissent, reinforce authority, and maintain societal order. Moreover, Vlad's life story illustrates the multifaceted challenges faced by leaders during a time defined by external invasions, internal factionalism, and fragile alliances. His ability to navigate these dangers with a combination of military prowess and uncompromising governance reflects wider historical themes evident throughout Eastern Europe in the medieval period. The tension between ruthless brutality and the establishment of order during his reign invites ongoing scholarly debate surrounding medieval concepts of justice, legitimacy, and survival strategies in politically unstable environments. Vlad the Impaler's legacy further reveals the intricate interaction between history and mythology, demonstrating how they coexist, influence, and reshape each other over centuries. His persona embodies stark contradictions as both a protector and a monster, a ruler who inspired both terror and admiration. The layered and often contradictory narratives surrounding Vlad serve as a rich case study in the evolution of cultural memory, showing how historical figures are continuously reinterpreted to meet shifting social, political, and cultural needs in contemporary Romania and beyond. Vlad remains a potent symbol invoked in national identity discourse as an emblem of resistance, resilience, and strength. Yet simultaneously, he serves as a cautionary figure, illustrating the darker realities of authoritarian rule and the wielding of violence for political ends. The persistent global fascination with Vlad the Impaler across academic research, media portrayals, and popular culture underscores the enduring relevance of his story in modern society and its multifaceted interpretations. His image has become a lens through which modern societies examine themes of power, fear, and identity, the duality of Vlad as both feared tyrant and national hero, highlights the complexities involved in understanding historical figures whose actions challenge simple moral categories. This complexity invites deeper reflection on the nature of leadership and the costs associated with survival in times of upheaval. In conclusion, Vlad the Impaler's impact extends far beyond his lifetime. His transformation from a medieval prince into a mythic figure exemplifies the complex interplay between fact and fiction in shaping historical memory and cultural identity. The ongoing scholarly exploration of his life encourages critical reflection on how history is remembered, retold, and repurposed, shaping collective identities and cultural narratives across generations. This marks the conclusion of Part 4 of Chapter 3. The next chapter will examine the diverse ways in which Vlad's image has been interpreted, adapted, and represented in modern media and popular culture, investigating what these portrayals reveal about contemporary attitudes toward history, violence, and heroism. During the years when Wallachia struggled to maintain its independence, the Impaler emerged as a ruler determined to restore order amid chaos. His ascent was shaped by constant warfare, internal power struggles, and the threat of Ottoman invasion. The principality was plagued by noble factions competing for influence. While the Ottoman Empire expanded aggressively into Eastern Europe, Vlad had to navigate these dangers to secure his reign and protect his homeland. From the beginning, Vlad employed a ruthless policy to deal with opposition. He targeted rebellious boyars, whose shifting loyalties weakened the state authority. He would arrest those suspected of treason and subject them to brutal punishments, often making examples of them. In public, to deter others, his tactics were meant to break the power of the aristocracy and strengthen centralized control which had long been lacking in Wallachia. This campaign against the boyards was relentless. Vlad saw in them the primary obstacle to uniting Wallachia and establishing firm rule. He understood that these powerful landowners frequently shifted allegiances between the Ottomans, Hungarians, and internal factions, making governance difficult and unstable. Vlad's methods were severe and often involved deception. He invited boyars to feasts, promising reconciliation, only to seize them and subject them to torture or execution. This created a climate of fear that discouraged rebellion but also fostered deep resentment. The boyard class was weakened but not entirely broken, forcing Vlad to maintain constant vigilance. Meanwhile, Vlad's military campaigns against the Ottomans were characterized by cunning tactics and brutal reprisals. The terrain of Wallachia offered natural advantages: dense forests, steep mountains, and narrow passes that Vlad used to his benefit. His forces specialized in hit-and-run raids, ambushes, and disrupting supply routes, rather than large-scale pitched battles. These tactics frustrated the Ottoman commanders, who found themselves unable to bring their full strength to bear against an elusive enemy. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II was expanding rapidly and determined to absorb Wallachia into its growing domain. Vlad's resistance was one of the few obstacles to their plans. This made Wallachia a critical buffer zone between Ottoman lands and Central Europe. The pressure on Vlad was immense and the stakes high. His strategic use of the landscape and mobile forces bought time, but at great cost to his people and soldiers. Vlad's use of terror was integral to his military and political strategy. The forests of impaled victims served as both punishment and psychological warfare designed to terrorize enemies and potential traitors. These gruesome displays were a visible assertion of his uncompromising authority. The sight of thousands of stakes topped with bodies would strike fear into the hearts of any who considered opposing him. The method was effective in deterring rebellion and in maintaining order within Wallachia, but it also deepened his reputation for cruelty and ruthlessness in addition to military matters. Vlad prioritized the strengthening of Wallachia's defenses. The restoration of Pornari Castle was central to this effort. Perched on a high cliff, the castle commanded views of the surrounding mountains and controlled key routes. Vlad reinforced the walls, improved fortifications, and used it as his principal stronghold. This allowed him to resist sieges and maintain a secure base of operations, even in times of intense conflict. Diplomatic relations during Vlad's rise were complex and precarious. His alliance with Hungary was essential, but fraught with mistrust. The Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus was initially a supporter, but grew wary of Vlad's brutal tactics and unpredictable behavior. This tension weakened Vlad's political position, making him vulnerable to isolation. Meanwhile, the Ottomans remained the primary external threat. Their repeated campaigns aimed to subdue Wallachia and integrate it fully into the empire. Despite these challenges, Vlad's resistance delayed Ottoman expansion for a time and won him recognition as a defender of Christian Europe. This earned him a grudging respect among some European leaders and chroniclers who viewed him as a bulwark against Islamic conquest. The duality of Vlad as both feared tyrant and reluctant hero is a defining feature of his legacy, reflecting the complex realities of 15th century Eastern Europe. Vlad's rise was not solely based on military might. It was also shaped by political savvy and psychological warfare. His ability to inspire fear was unmatched. He understood that in a region torn by factionalism and external threats, traditional forms of rule were insufficient. Fear was a tool to consolidate power, to prevent dissent, and to unify a fractured principality. His reign demonstrates how terror can be wielded as an instrument of governance, particularly in times of crisis. The social impact of Vlad's rule was profound. Wallachian society experienced a harsh order imposed by severe punishments and strict laws. The common people lived under the shadow of the bourgeois and their conflicts, but also under the watchful eye of a prince willing to enforce justice ruthlessly. This created a fragile peace, but also left a legacy of suffering and resentment that would echo through generations. The economic toll of constant warfare and brutal repression was significant. Agriculture and trade suffered. The disruption caused by Ottoman invasions and internal strife drained resources and destabilized communities. Nonetheless, Vlad's control prevented total collapse and maintained a semblance of sovereignty in a region caught between great powers. Vlad's personal character is difficult to fully discern through the veil of myth and legend, but historical accounts portray a man of formidable will and uncompromising resolve. His reputation for cruelty was intertwined with a deep sense of duty to protect his land. His bloody rise was the product of necessity, ambition, and a ruthless understanding of the political landscape. Throughout his ascent, Vlad remained vigilant against betrayal and conspiracies. He maintained an extensive network of spies and informants to monitor both internal dissent and external threats. Intelligence operations were crucial in a world where alliances shifted rapidly and loyalties were often uncertain. This allowed him to preempt plots and respond swiftly to challenges. Vlad's methods, while brutal, were effective in a time and place defined by violence and instability. His reign provides insight into the dynamics of medieval statecraft warfare and the use of terror as a means of control. His legacy is a complex blend of fear, power, and resistance against overwhelming odds. This part concludes the detailed account of Vlad the Impaler's bloody rise to power. The next section will focus on the final years of his reign, the decline of his influence, and the beginnings of the transformation of his image into legend and myth. The story of Vlad the Impaler does not end with his bloody rise to power, for while his reign was marked by unparalleled cruelty and ruthless determination, the final years of his life reveal the limits of even the most iron-fisted rule. The political landscape of Wallachia was ever-shifting, marked by intrigue, internal betrayals, and the relentless pressure of powerful neighbors. Vlad's fall from power was as violent and dramatic as his ascent, casting a shadow over the legacy he left behind after years of fierce resistance. Vlad's grip on Wallachia grew increasingly tenuous. The bourgeois, who had been weakened but not destroyed, remained a source of persistent opposition. Their hatred for Vlad's harsh policies did not diminish, and they continuously plotted to undermine his rule. The internal divisions that plagued Wallachia made governance precarious and forced Vlad to expend much of his energy on suppressing conspiracies and rebellions. The atmosphere was one of constant suspicion and danger, where trust was a scarce commodity. Externally, the Ottoman Empire intensified its campaigns to bring Wallachia under full control. Sultan Mehmed II was determined to break Vlad's resistance. The Ottomans marshaled vast armies and resources in repeated invasions that strained the principality's defenses. Vlad's guerrilla tactics and use of the difficult terrain had slowed the Ottoman advance, but could not stop it indefinitely. The overwhelming power of the empire was a constant threat, looming over every decision Vlad made. The political situation became even more complicated with the shifting alliances of neighboring powers. The Kingdom of Hungary, initially a supporter of Vlad, grew wary of his unpredictable behavior and brutal methods. King Matthias Corvinus's patience wore thin as Vlad's actions increasingly threatened to destabilize the region. The Hungarian court viewed Vlad as a liability rather than an asset. Their support waned and diplomatic isolation deepened. the fragile network of alliances that Vlad relied upon began to crumble. Amid these pressures, Vlad's reign faced a decisive turning point. In 1462 he was captured by Hungarian forces. The circumstances surrounding his arrest remain shrouded in mystery, with conflicting accounts suggesting political betrayal or military defeat. Regardless, the imprisonment marked a dramatic end to his direct rule for over a decade. Vlad was held captive, removed from the turbulent political scene. His absence created a power vacuum that intensified the chaos within Wallachia during his imprisonment. Vlad's reputation only grew. The tales of his cruelty, the forest of impaled victims, and his unyielding resistance became legendary stories, passed along by travelers, envoys, and chroniclers. These stories elevated Vlad beyond a mere historical figure, turning him into a symbol of terror and strength. His persona began to transcend reality, blending with folklore and myth. His name spread throughout Europe, evoking fear and fascination alike. Vlad's captivity itself was fraught with uncertainty. His imprisonment is believed to have lasted over a decade, though records are unclear. The conditions of his confinement remain the subject of speculation. Some accounts suggest harsh treatment, while others hint at a degree of noble prisoner status. Given his royal blood, regardless, the period away from power weakened his influence and left his supporters vulnerable to internal rival factions vying for control of Wallachia. Following his release, Vlad sought to reclaim his throne, but the Wallachia that awaited him was vastly changed. Years of conflict, shifting power dynamics, and foreign intervention had altered the political landscape. His support was diminished, many old allies had disappeared, and new enemies emerged. His return was marked by renewed violence and instability as he fought to reassert control. The brief resurgence could not restore the stability of earlier years, and Vlad's final days remained cloaked in uncertainty. The political rivalries within Wallachia intensified. The boyars who had endured his brutal reign saw an opportunity to reassert their power. The tenuous alliances that had once held the principality together fragmented further, creating an environment ripe for continued strife. Attempts to impose order met fierce resistance, and the principality became a battleground for competing factions. Each side sought to secure their own interests. Amid the chaos, it is believed that around 1476 Vlad died in battle, though exact details remain unclear. His death was violent, and his body reportedly severed and sent to the Ottomans as proof of his demise. This brutal end was fitting for a life defined by war, bloodshed, and unrelenting conflict. His death closed the chapter on a reign that had left an indelible mark on the history of Eastern Europe. But it was only the beginning of his transformation into legend. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler is a complex tapestry woven from threads of history, myth, and cultural memory. His life and reign embodied the brutal realities of 15th century politics, where violence was a currency of power and survival. The terror he employed was a calculated tool used to forge order from chaos, to defend a fractured land caught between empires and internal strife. Over centuries, Vlad's image evolved far beyond the historical prince who ruled Wallachia. His connection to the Order of the Dragon and his father, Vlad Dracula, laid the groundwork for symbolic associations with darkness and the supernatural. The stories of impalement and cruelty merged with emerging vampire myths, creating a Gothic archetype immortalized in literature, most famously by Bram Stoker as Dracula. This fictional portrayal distanced Vlad from his historical roots, yet ensured his enduring presence in popular culture. Despite the layers of myth, scholars continue to investigate Vlad's life, seeking to uncover the realities beneath the legends. His reign offers valuable insight into medieval governance, warfare, and the psychological use of terror. The contradictions of his character, a ruthless tyrant, protector of his people, and a national hero, reflect the complexities of leadership in a turbulent era. In modern Romania, Vlad remains a potent figure, evoked in discussions of national identity, resistance, and strength. Yet he also serves as a cautionary example of the dangers of authoritarian rule and the human cost of political violence. His story invites reflection on power, fear, and morality, themes that resonate across time and place. The bloody rise of Vlad the Impaler Dracula is a story of ambition, violence, and survival. It is a window into a world where harsh realities shaped extraordinary figures whose legacies transcend history into myth. His life challenges simple interpretations, revealing a man shaped by his times, driven by necessity, and remembered for both terror and tenacity. Beyond the historical records, Vlad the Impaler's impact has permeated art, culture, and national consciousness. His figure appears in countless works, from paintings to operas to modern cinema. Each interpretation reflects contemporary concerns with power, justice, and the nature of evil. The duality of Vlad, as both feared tyrant and heroic defender, embodies humanity's struggle to understand the complex nature of leadership and morality. In the centuries following his death, Vlad became a symbol in Romanian folklore, embodying both the harshness required to defend the nation and the dangers of unchecked authority. The stories told around campfires and in village squares painted him as a guardian of the land, but also as a figure whose cruelty was legendary. This dual image has persisted, shaping Romanian identity and collective memory. Internationally, Vlad the Impaler has become synonymous with the vampire mythos. His historical deeds provided fertile ground for Gothic fiction, spawning a global fascination that continues to captivate audiences today. This transformation from medieval prince to mythical vampire illustrates the power of narrative in shaping historical memory and cultural symbolism. The continued academic study of Vlad's life and times enriches understanding of 15th century Eastern Europe, the volatile political landscape, the interplay of empires, the nature of medieval warfare and governance come into sharper focus through his story. His reign highlights the challenges of leadership in an era when brutality was often seen as necessary to maintain order and sovereignty. In reflecting on Vlad the Impaler's life, modern perspectives grapple with the moral ambiguity of his actions. The balance between protector and oppressor raises questions about the costs of power and survival in a world of constant threat and betrayal. His ruthless methods reflect the harsh realities faced by rulers of his time. His legacy invites ongoing debate about justice, legitimacy, and the exercise of authority. Ultimately, the bloody rise and fall of Vlad the Impaler, Dracula offers a profound glimpse into the human dimensions of history. Where myth and fact collide, his story endures as a testament to the complexities of power, the resilience of memory, and the enduring fascination with figures who defy simple categorization. This marks the end of segment 3 on the bloody rise of Vlad the Impaler, Dracula. The following chapters will explore the enduring impact of his image across culture, media, and collective memory, tracing how history and legend intertwine in shaping the figure known to the world as Dracula. The final chapter in the turbulent life of Vlad the Impaler began amid a landscape steeped in uncertainty and unrest. A land once ruled by a fierce and unyielding prince now stood weary from decades of strife and incessant warfare. The Principality of Wallachia had long been a place where power was hard-won and icily lost, a borderland between empires. It was a region marked by shifting alliances, political intrigue, and the ever-present threat of invasion. Vlad himself had been a symbol of strength and terror in these lands. His name was whispered in fear among enemies and allies alike. Yet as the years wore on, even the most ruthless rulers faced the relentless erosion of power. The scars left by his bloody campaigns and harsh methods left many enemies within his own borders. Those who had survived his purges, the bourgeois nobility, remained a constant threat. Their resentment was deep-rooted, and their desire for vengeance burned bright. These bourgeois had once wielded significant influence over Wallachia. Their loyalties often shifted between foreign powers as they sought to preserve their wealth and status. Vlad's brutal methods had diminished their power but not destroyed their ambitions. Many had fled to neighboring lands or gone into hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Their plots became more frequent, each aimed at weakening Vlad's hold on the throne. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of Wallachia, the mighty Ottoman Empire continued to cast its long shadow over Eastern Europe. Sultan Mehmed II was relentless in his pursuit of expanding Ottoman dominion. The principality was a prize coveted for its strategic position, serving as a buffer between the Ottoman lands and Central Europe. The empire's armies were vast and well-equipped, and its resources seemingly endless. Vlad's earlier successes in delaying Ottoman conquest only fueled their determination to bring Wallachia fully under control. This looming external threat added another layer of complexity to an already volatile political environment. Wallachia's neighbors watched closely as alliances shifted with alarming frequency. The Kingdom of Hungary had once been an important ally for Vlad, but the changing tides of politics and Vlad's own unpredictable temperament strained relations. The Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus grew increasingly cautious of Vlad's erratic actions and harsh punishments. Their fragile alliance began to unravel as Hungarian interests diverged from Vlad's own ambitions. Within this web of internal rivalries and external pressures, Vlad faced the daunting task of maintaining his authority and protecting his homeland. The once unshakable grip he had on Wallachia showed signs of weakening. His loyal supporters dwindled in number, while his enemies multiplied. Their combined forces grew bolder and more coordinated. The battlefield was no longer the open fields where Vlad's guerrilla tactics had once dominated, but a landscape marked by political machinations and ever-shifting loyalties. Despite these mounting challenges, Vlad remained resolute. He was a man forged in the crucible of war, accustomed to facing overwhelming odds and emerging victorious. His reputation for cruelty was as much a weapon as his sword. The terror he inspired kept many foes at bay and ensured obedience among his followers. Yet fear alone was insufficient to secure lasting power in a land ravaged by decades of conflict. In this critical moment, Vlad sought to rebuild his forces, rally his allies, and reclaim the dominance he had once commanded. His strategy was a careful blend of military maneuvering and psychological warfare, relying on surprise attacks, ambushes, and the brutal display of punishment to intimidate enemies. The forests and mountains of Wallachia once again became his allies, offering refuge and opportunities to strike. Swiftly before disappearing into the shadows, however, the world around Vlad had changed. His enemies had learned from his tactics. They adapted to the harsh terrain and improved their coordination. Their armies were larger, better equipped, and driven by the desire to end Vlad's reign. Once and for all, the war had taken a toll on the people of Wallachia, who were exhausted from constant raids, sieges, and the economic strain of prolonged conflict. The social fabric was frayed, and the prince's harsh rule had left many disillusioned. Trust was a rare commodity in Vlad's court. The constant threat of betrayal forced him into a state of perpetual vigilance. His network of spies and informants worked tirelessly to uncover plots before they could be executed. Yet even with such measures, paranoia was unavoidable. In an environment where friends could become foes in an instant, every decision carried risks that could prove fatal. As the pressure mounted, Vlad's political isolation deepened. The weakening of his alliances was a blow to his ability to resist external forces. His diplomatic options narrowed, leaving him increasingly dependent on military might and the fear he could instill. As neighboring powers weighed their interests, many chose to distance themselves, hoping to avoid the chaos engulfing Wallachia. The prince found himself increasingly alone in a hostile world. The years leading up to Vlad's final fall were marked by a series of attempts to regain control. Some were military campaigns, others political maneuvers designed to root out dissent within his domain. The battles were fierce and costly, with heavy losses on all sides. Yet no victory was decisive enough to secure lasting peace or stability. Vlad's forces were stretched thin, and the land itself bore the scars of unending warfare amid this turmoil. The prince's health and resolve were tested. The burden of leadership in such a volatile environment took its toll. The physical demands of warfare and the mental strain of constant vigilance weighed heavily on those closest to Vlad. Whispers spread of fatigue and diminishing strength, but the prince remained outwardly defiant, continuing to fight for his vision of a strong, independent Wallachia. The environment of fear and violence that Vlad had once mastered now threatened to consume him. The very tactics that had secured his rise became double-edged. The boyars who had once cowered now plotted openly, emboldened by the support of foreign powers. The Ottomans pressed their advantage, and the Hungarian crown withdrew support, signaling a shift in regional power dynamics. Vlad's final years were thus a period of unrelenting struggle, caught between the ambitions of great empires and the bitter rivalries of his own people. The prince's legendary ferocity was no longer enough to overcome the growing forces aligned against him. The game of survival in medieval Eastern Europe was brutal and unforgiving, demanding not just strength but also the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of politics and alliance. The stage was set for the concluding events in Vlad's life, a culmination of decades of conflict and the inevitable consequences of his reign. His fall from power was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion marked by defeats, political betrayals, and the loss of support. Among the chaos, the story of Vlad the Impaler would enter its final and most mysterious chapter. This concludes part 1 of the story of the final fall and death of Vlad the Impaler. The next section will delve into the dramatic events of Vlad to capture, his imprisonment, and the enduring legend that grew from the shadows of his downfall. After years of fierce conflict, Vlad's power weakened, enemies closed in from all sides without mercy. His brutal methods had earned him many foes. No one could ignore the terror he spread. By 1462, the tides had turned against him. His hold on Wallachia grew fragile and thin. Some whispered that betrayal led to his capture. Others claimed it was defeat on the battlefield. Hungarian forces seized Vlad unexpectedly. Their motives tangled with politics and fear. The true story remains shrouded in mystery. Different accounts tell conflicting versions. One tale speaks of Bojars plotting in secret, a conspiracy to topple the feared prince. Another says a rival lord arranged his fall, using deceit rather than open warfare. Some say Vlad's own brother played a part, a shadow in the dark of palace intrigue. Others claim Ottoman spies infiltrated, deep feeding lies and rumors to sow discord. Whatever the cause, Vlad was taken prisoner. His enemies celebrated his sudden downfall. For over a decade he remained captive, locked away in harsh and lonely confinement far from Wallachia's forests and mountains. His kingdom rotted without its fierce leader. The prisons were cold and unforgiving, the days long and the nights endless. Stories tell of harsh conditions endured, of isolation breaking even the strongest men. His guards were many, but his spirit remained. The flame of defiance burned deep within. The Boyards seized the chance to regain power. They scrambled for control of the fractured state. Rival factions fought bitterly among themselves. Blood spilled in endless feuds and uprisings. Many noble families returned from exile, eager to reclaim lands and titles. Lost power shifted quickly like wind-blown leaves. Alliances were fragile and easily broken. Villages suffered under the weight of chaos. Farmers fled their fields, leaving crops to rot. The economy collapsed under the strain. Trade routes were unsafe and often blocked. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire pressed harder, determined to bring Wallachia under its sway. Sultan Mehmed II sought full conquest. His armies moved relentlessly forward. Sieges laid waste to towns and castles. Smoke and fire darkened the skies. Though Vlad was gone, the threat remained fierce. The borderlands were caught in deadly conflict. Raids and skirmishes terrorized the countryside. Families were torn apart by war and famine. The people whispered Vlad's name with fear, recalling the forests of impaled victims. His name transformed into whispered legend. Stories of cruelty traveled far and wide. Travelers spoke of forests filled with stakes, of impaled victims left for all to see. Envoys told courts tales of brutal justice. The terror was both real and exaggerated. His fearsome reputation spread across Europe, a symbol of ruthless defiance and pain. For many, Vlad was a figure of dread. For others, he was a heroic defender. Despite captivity, Vlad never lost hope. His spirit remained strong in darkest hours. He plotted and dreamed of return to power. His resolve grew even behind prison walls. Years passed slowly in cold isolation, but Vlad's mind stayed sharp and focused. He studied the politics of his captors. Learning their weaknesses and intentions, allies worked secretly to negotiate freedom. Or perhaps a daring escape was arranged. Letters smuggled through trusted hands. Whispered plans carried on the wind. The exact details of his release are unclear. Some say ransom paid, others a secret deal. What is certain is Vlad soon regained freedom. He set his sights again on his shattered land, Wallachia. He found change beyond recognition. Chaos ruled where order once prevailed. Old loyalties were broken or forgotten. New threats arose from every direction. The people were weary from endless fighting. Many had lost faith in their prince. Bandits roamed freely across the land. Villages lay abandoned and ruined. Still, Vlad fought to reclaim his throne, determined to restore his former reign. He gathered loyal followers around him, prepared to face enemies old and new. His campaigns were brutal and relentless, yet the land had grown weary of war. The world had changed since his first rule. Opponents adapted to his fierce tactics. Guerrilla warfare was harder to wage. Now, his forces were fewer and badly worn. Battles became bloodier and more desperate. Walls and fortresses changed hands repeatedly. Villagers suffered under constant raids. Famine and disease followed the violence. The weather grew colder, adding hardship. Winters were harsh and merciless. Trust among allies was fragile and fleeting. Fear no longer bound loyalty firmly. Political intrigue thickened the air. Plots and betrayals were commonplace. Many once loyal commanders defected, seeking their own survival and gain. Every victory Vlad won came with cost. Setbacks quickly followed each triumph. His enemies multiplied and grew bolder. Foreign powers eyed Wallachia greedily. Hungary's king, once Vlad's supporter, now saw him as a dangerous liability. Matthias Corvinus distanced himself, seeking peace at the expense of Vlad. The Hungarian court feared wars spread. They wished to avoid further bloodshed. The Ottoman Empire seized the opportunity. Massive armies crossed the borderlands. They pushed relentlessly into Wallachia, determined to crush the prince's resistance. Ottoman forces were well supplied and trained. They marched with purpose and overwhelming force. Vlad fought fiercely with desperate courage. His warriors remained loyal, though outnumbered, but age and injury took their toll. His strength and influence waned with time. The prince's face showed the scars of battle. His eyes held the weight of countless losses. His final battles were brutal. Last stands, skirmishes and sieges. Stained, the land red, the air was thick with smoke and cries. The ground soaked with blood and mud. Stories tell of blood-soaked fields and broken swords of villagers burned and lives shattered. The peasants endured suffering beyond measure, their lives marked by grief and fear. Some whispered of Vlad's cruel punishments. Others recalled his protection from worse fates. Historians note the wider European context. The Ottoman advance threatened Christian kingdoms. The fall of Constantinople had shaken the world. Walls cracked in the face of unstoppable force. Vlad's resistance delayed Ottoman plans, buying time for Hungary and others to prepare. Yet political divisions among Christian states weakened their united front against the empire. Hungary's cautious diplomacy often conflicted with Vlad's uncompromising and violent stance. The complex alliances shaped the fate of the region and influenced the final years of Vlad's rule. The prince's story illustrates the brutal reality of a land caught between empires and survival. The exact details of Vlad's death remain unclear. Some say he fell in battle in late 1476. Others believe assassination or capture. His end is veiled by legend and time. What is agreed is his death was violent. His body was severed and sent to Ottomans. This gruesome proof ended his bloody reign, a stark symbol of the era's cruelty. Vlad the Impaler's life closed in chaos, yet his legacy lived on in fear and folklore. His rise and fall were two sides of a brutal coin, power achieved and lost through bloodshed and terror. This marks the end of part 2 of the final fall and death of Vlad the Impaler. In the next part we will examine the turbulent aftermath of his death, and how legend grew to overshadow history itself. The years following Vlad's release from captivity were marked by relentless struggle and near constant warfare. His return to power was shadowed by the fractures within Wallachia and the growing threat from external enemies. The political landscape had shifted dramatically, leaving the principality vulnerable and divided. His old methods of ruling with fear and terror no longer guaranteed obedience as they once had. His enemies had adapted, and his own allies remained uncertain. His grip on power was tenuous at best, forcing Vlad into a brutal contest for survival with no room for error. The boyards who had long chafed under his rule regained their footing, while new factions emerged, each vying for influence and control. The memory of his cruelty was fresh, but so too was the fear that without him, Wallachia might fall entirely under Ottoman dominion. The Ottoman Empire pushed steadily westward, while Hungary and Moldavia watched with wary eyes the alliances that once supported. Vlad now faltered as regional powers recalibrated their interests. His diplomatic isolation grew as foreign courts sought to avoid further conflict and instability. Vlad's military campaigns during these final years became more desperate and bloodied than ever. Before his imprisonment, his swift guerrilla tactics had proven effective. But now his forces were fewer and less able to confront the larger armies arrayed against him. The dense forests and rugged mountains that had once concealed his ambushes no longer provided the same advantage. His men were exhausted, and supplies dwindled as Wallachia suffered under the strain of prolonged warfare. Civilians bore the brunt of this violence, fleeing villages and farms as armies ravaged the land. Despite these setbacks, Vlad remained defiant, determined to reclaim the strength of his earlier reign. He sought to rally loyal followers and consolidate power through a combination of military action and ruthless political moves. His public displays of punishment aimed to intimidate opponents, but increasingly failed to inspire fear or loyalty. Many who once trembled before him now plotted in secret, ready to strike at the moment of weakness. The realm was rife with suspicion and betrayal, and trust was a luxury Vlad could no longer afford. The wider geopolitical context shaped Vlad's final struggles. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was relentless in his campaign to absorb Wallachia and secure his empire's western frontier. The fall of Constantinople had emboldened the Ottomans and made the stakes of Vlad's resistance even higher. The Kingdom of Hungary under Matthias Corvinus sought to contain Ottoman expansion, but was cautious in its support of Vlad, wary of provoking further conflict. The shifting alliances left Wallachia caught between two great powers, each intent on securing its own interests, at the expense of the Principality's independence. Vlad's position was precarious. His authority challenged by enemies within and armies without. The boyars negotiated with foreign powers, hoping to secure their own positions, and sometimes betraying Wallachian interests for personal gain. Vlad's network of spies and informants worked tirelessly to uncover plots, but the sheer scale of conspiracies and unrest was overwhelming. The prince's health deteriorated under the strain of constant vigilance and the physical toll of battle. Reports from contemporaries speak of a man growing weary, but still consumed by the desire to defend his homeland. Skirmishes and sieges marked the years leading to Vlad's final confrontation. Each battle drained his forces and devastated the land. The countryside was scarred by fire and blood, with families displaced and crops destroyed. The economic strain further weakened Wallachia's ability to sustain prolonged resistance. Vlad's military might was reduced to small pockets of loyal fighters engaged in hit-and-run attacks, unable to challenge the Ottomans or their allies in open battle. The strategic landscape had shifted against him as the empire's resources and manpower overwhelmed local resistance. As winter gave way to spring in 1476, the stage was set for Vlad's last stand. His enemies consolidated their strength, seeking to end his rule. Once and for all, accounts differ on the precise details, but many agree that the prince was killed during a fierce battle near the village of Bucharest. Some historians speculate that he was ambushed, while others suggest he died fighting valiantly on the front lines. His death was violent and brutal, fitting the harshness of the era. His body was reportedly decapitated and sent to the Ottoman Sultan as a grisly confirmation of his demise. The immediate aftermath of Vlad's death plunged Wallachia deeper into turmoil. The power vacuum ignited fresh conflicts among noble families and invited increased foreign intervention. The Ottomans intensified their efforts to incorporate the principality, while Hungary attempted to exert influence through puppet rulers. The land itself suffered the consequences of decades of war, famine, and displacement. Its people were exhausted and yearning for peace, but such reprieve was distant. The legacy of Vlad's reign was a complex mix of fear, respect, and deep divisions that would shape the region for generations. Despite the fall of Vlad the Impaler, his name and story did not fade into obscurity. Instead, his life became enshrined in legend and folklore. His reputation for cruelty and resilience transformed into a symbol of resistance and horror. The forests of impaled victims became stories told to warn and frighten. His figure crossed borders, carried by travelers and chroniclers, evolving into myth and literary archetype. Centuries later, Bram Stoker would draw on these tales, crafting the character of Dracula, embedding Vlad's legacy in global culture far beyond his historical life. Scholars continue to debate and study Vlad's reign, seeking to separate fact from fiction. They recognize the brutal necessities of medieval politics and warfare, and the extreme measures rulers employed to survive. His story is a window into a world defined by survival, power struggles, and the blurred lines between tyranny and leadership. Vlad's final fall reflects the tragic end of a man shaped by his times, caught in the violent tides of history, whose legacy challenges simple interpretations. This concludes part 3 of the final fall and death of Vlad the Impaler. The final part will explore how Vlad's legend grew over the centuries, becoming a mythic figure whose story transcends history and continues to captivate imaginations. Today, the death of Vlad the Impaler did not mark the end of his influence, but rather the beginning of a legend that would grow and evolve across centuries. His life story passed from whispered tales among villagers to the grand courts of Europe. His name became synonymous with terror, courage, and unyielding resistance. The man who once ruled Wallachia with iron and blood became immortalized in folklore and myth, far beyond the borders he fought to defend. In the decades after his death, stories of Vlad's cruelty spread like wildfire across Eastern Europe. Travelers, envoys, and merchants carried tales of his forests of impaled victims. His brutal methods were recounted with awe and horror. Some tales were exaggerated, while others were grounded in grim reality. Yet all contributed to the growing mythos surrounding his figure. These stories served both as warnings and as legends, inspiring fear and fascination among common folk and nobility alike. The memory of Vlad was shaped by the political and cultural forces of the times. His connection to the Order of the Dragon and the legacy of his father, Vlad Dracula, added layers of symbolic meaning to his persona. The dragon symbolized strength, protection, and Christian resistance against the Ottoman threat. These associations reinforced Vlad's image as a defender of Christendom. Even as his methods were condemned by many, his life embodied the brutal choices faced by rulers in a turbulent and violent era, where survival often meant sacrifice and ruthless resolve. European writers and chroniclers contributed to the evolution of Vlad's image. The dramatic and often brutal events of his reign provided rich material for stories and histories. Some portrayed him as a national hero who fought tirelessly against the Ottoman Empire. Others emphasized his cruelty and painted him as a tyrant. These competing narratives reflected the complex legacy Vlad left behind, shaped by both fact and fiction, and colored by the perspectives of various political and religious interests. The rise of Gothic literature centuries later would draw heavily on the legends of Vlad the Impaler. The publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897 cemented Vlad's place in popular culture. The fictional Count Dracula was inspired in part by Vlad's name and fearsome reputation, though the novel itself was a work of fantasy blending myth and horror. The vampire archetype created by Stoker captured imaginations worldwide, turning Vlad into an icon of darkness and immortality, detached from the historical realities of his reign. This transformation of Vlad from historical prince to mythical vampire illustrates the power of storytelling to reshape history. His real life was marked by political intrigue, warfare, and survival. His legend added supernatural elements that made him a symbol of fear beyond the mortal realm. This blending of history and myth has fascinated scholars, artists, and audiences for generations, inspiring countless adaptations in literature, film, and folklore across the globe. Despite the myths, Vlad's historical importance remains clear. He provides a window into the harsh realities of 15th century Eastern Europe, where power was often won and lost through violence. His reign shows how terror could be used as a political tool to enforce order and resist powerful enemies. His life reflects the challenges faced by small states, caught between empires, and the difficult decisions required for survival. His story reveals the complexities of leadership in a world defined by shifting alliances, brutal warfare, and political intrigue. Modern Romania continues to grapple with Vlad's legacy. He is both a source of national pride and a reminder of the dark sides of power. His image is used to symbolize strength, independence, and resistance against foreign domination. Yet his brutal methods also prompt reflection on the costs of authoritarian rule and the human suffering it caused. Vlad remains a complex figure whose story resists simple moral judgment, inspiring debate about history, identity, and memory. The story of Vlad the Impaler challenges us to consider the nature of leadership in times of crisis. His ability to inspire fear and loyalty reveals the fragile balance rulers must maintain. His reign was shaped by extraordinary circumstances, demanding extraordinary actions. His final fall was not just the death of a man, but the close of a chapter in a violent and uncertain world, marked by the clash of civilizations and the struggle for survival. As the centuries pass, the legend of Vlad the Impaler continues to captivate and haunt imaginations. His story has been retold in countless forms, from academic histories to films and literature. Each retelling adds new layers of meaning, reflecting contemporary values and fears. His legacy endures because it speaks to universal themes of power, violence, resistance, and the human condition, offering insights into the darkest and most resilient aspects of humanity. In the end, Vlad the Impaler's life and death reveal the complexity of history itself. A man both feared and revered, shaped by the times he lived in and the choices he made. His story is a reminder that history is never simple, that heroes and villains often share the same face, and that legends are born from the interplay of fact and imagination. His life teaches us about the consequences of absolute power and the enduring impact of stories passed through generations. The influence of Vlad extends beyond history books and legends. His name is woven into the fabric of culture and identity across the region. His story has inspired art, monuments, and tourism in Romania, drawing visitors fascinated by the man and the myth. This continuing interest reflects a deep human desire to understand the past through figures who embody its fears, hopes, and contradictions. Vlad remains a symbol whose meaning evolves with each generation. Even today, historians continue to uncover new details about Vlad's life, his political alliances, military campaigns, and the society he ruled. His legacy encourages ongoing exploration of medieval Eastern Europe and the forces that shaped its history. By examining Vlad's reign, we gain insight into the challenges faced by small nations, caught between empires, and the extreme measures taken to maintain sovereignty and order. The story of Vlad the Impaler is not just about a single man, but about an era marked by transformation, conflict, and the relentless pursuit of power. It reminds us how history is shaped by individuals whose actions resonate far beyond their own lifetimes. It reveals how narratives are constructed and reconstructed, reflecting the values and anxieties of each age. It invites us to look beyond simple judgments and to appreciate the complexities of the past. Thus, the tale of Vlad the Impaler remains alive in history, myth, and culture, continuing to inspire debate, fascination, and creativity across the world. His life and legend challenge us to reflect on the nature of power, justice, and identity, reminding us that the stories we tell shape the way we understand ourselves and our world. Vlad's story also serves as a stark reminder of the human cost behind the myths. His reign was marked not only by power and legend, but by suffering and loss. Families were torn apart, communities shattered, and lives forever altered. The brutal tactics employed, though effective, were never without consequence on the fabric of society and the souls of the people. The forests where victims were impaled were more than gruesome spectacles. They were symbols of terror, but also of a desperate attempt to maintain order and resist overwhelming forces. Vlad's Wallachia stood as a battleground between the East and West, where survival meant harsh and often cruel choices. This complexity makes Vlad a figure of endless fascination. For some, he embodies the ruthless protector willing to make terrible sacrifices for his homeland. For others, he is the embodiment of tyranny and cruelty, whose legacy warns against unchecked power. His story resists easy categorization, reflecting the contradictions of human nature itself. The cultural impact of Vlad's legend can be seen in how his image has been adapted across different mediums and eras, from statues and museums in Romania to countless films and novels worldwide. His persona has morphed to fit the needs of the moment. His story touches on universal fears of death, darkness, and the unknown, while also speaking to resilience and defiance. At its core, the legend of Vlad the Impaler forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, justice, and memory. It challenges us to question how history is recorded, who writes it, and what stories are told or forgotten. It reminds us that legends are not merely fantasies, but mirrors reflecting the hopes, fears, and struggles of societies through time. Thank you for listening to this extended chapter on Vlad the Impaler and his enduring legacy. This concludes this segment of Boring History for Sleep. The next chapter will explore how the figure of Dracula emerged from this historical foundation to become a global cultural phenomenon, captivating audiences for centuries.